Hello and welcome back to the Ask Abhijit show. This is the first episode of this new year 2026. So I wish you all a very happy 2026. And I hope you're all doing great. And in this episode, we're going to discuss history and geopolitics. We'll start with geopolitics. Today is a great day for freedom and human rights and democracy, as we all know. So we'll discuss that. And I'll take other questions as well that you all have asked in the comments. So, as you all know, hopefully, the Ask Abhijit show is the objective, the purpose of the Ask Abhijit show is to understand the world that we live in through the three primary lenses of history, geopolitics, and science. And today we're going to discuss geopolitics and history. So, before I start the questions and answers, let me see who all is there on the live chat. I can see Vinay Rane 5, who's a new member. Vinay Rane, thank you very much for becoming a member and welcome to the membership of this channel. Thank you very much. I can see Geopolitical Dubey from Indore. Good evening. Riyansh Shah from New York. Good morning. Mac 4 J1U. I am confused is here. Anonymous R7U5T Shatabhish. Achintya Anand. Namaskar. Real Vladimir Putin. Nirvana Shanks. Buenas noches. Nirvana Shanks' son. Advait Ashwini Ayush Singh. Pranam. Daksh, Real Vladimir Putin once again. Somi is here. Commando 256. Tanmay Deshpande. Akshay Bharadwaj. Krishna of the Surinamese Netherlands. Hello. Good to have you. Nirvana Shanks once again. Lage raho online. Har Har Mahadev. Abhishek Shukla live. Venezuela gone. Animish Bharatia is here from California. Shishir Upadhyay. Namaste. Sharad Subhadra. Takina T8G. Somi from Jaipur. Sagar Gare, hello. The Baron Zemo, hello and namaste. Animish from California. Alvin Rodriguez, hello. Pankaj Dagar. Praneeth Kumar. Mystic SK. Jai Shri Krishna. Parth Srivastav from X. Parth is watching from X. Hello. Udbhav Sharma, Rahul Dunake, namaskar. Anonymous Scientist, bonjour. Manisha Cardoso, namaste ji. Sujit Shanagonda, namaskaram. Sam the Gamer, happy new year. Shatabish, Surya Pratap, no war, peace. Om Bekerikar, hello, good to have you. Vignesh is here. Vignesh Kohli from Navi Mumbai. Dorji is here from Nagaland. Good to see you. And welcome. Chaitanya Manuja, Shivansh Shankar, Ritvij, Riyansh Shah, The Little Kim, hello comrade, Arka, Alvin Rodriguez once again, Shrivatsa Guten Abend, indeed, Himanshu Rajpurohit from Chennai, Amisha Mishra, good to see you ma'am, Sittu, Lagero online, Gnaneshwar Raju, Surya Pratap, Palden, Vaibhav, Sentinel Spy, Sandy, hello. Commando, Situ, once again. It's Anjay. Okay, it's Anjay. Good evening. Crash and Rise, bonjour. Levi Ackerman, hello. Good to see you after a while. Good to see you. I hope you're doing good. Plank Cog, Ritwij, and so many other people. I won't be able to greet you all individually, but hello. Good to have you. Thank you so much. Pankaj is here from Prague in the Czech Republic. Priyanka Javalia, namaste. Okay. Let's get going with the questions. What are the questions? What do we have? Where do we begin? I suppose we should begin with, well, the question that we should all begin with, which is this one. This is by Argentina Parao from Facebook. I live stream on Facebook too. The question is, what do you think will happen to the rest of the Latin American countries that are aligned with Maduro's government in Venezuela if the United States manages to overthrow that government? Do you think the left will weaken? Well, the United States has indeed now overthrown that government. So this happened just a few hours ago. It is still nighttime there. And what's happened is that the United States military has gone in and you had all these clips on social media of the US, launching airstrikes on Caracas, the Venezuelan capital, and then Shri Donald Trump ji, he has announced that they have abducted or captured rather the president of Venezuela, Mr. Nicolas Maduro, and apparently he is being taken to the United States, where he will stand trial, a free and fair trial according to the laws of the United States. Right? So apparently now the laws of the United States apply everywhere, at least in the Western Hemisphere, apparently. Right? So they went in. It's reminiscent of what the Americans did in the 1980s to Nicaragua. Nicaragua, when I was a kid in the 80s, was it 80s or 90s, whenever it was, the Americans went in and they abducted Manuel Noriega, who was the person who ruled Nicaragua at the time, and they took him to the United States and they charged him with the drugs and whatnot, drug trafficking and whatever else, I suppose terrorism, drug trafficking, etc., etc., and they put him behind bars, and I suppose he is still behind bars somewhere in the United States. So that's what they've done to Venezuela. So the question is, what's the deal? What's going on? What's going to happen now? Right? To understand and what's the importance of all of this very rapidly evolving situation geopolitically, not just in the Western Hemisphere, not just for Venezuela, not just for Latin America, not just for the US, but for other nations, India, Russia, China, Asia, etc. What's the implications? So where do we begin this discussion? Let us begin by talking about the Monroe Doctrine and then the Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. So what is the Monroe Doctrine? It was an 1823 American foreign policy. Okay, and it declared that the Americas, North and South America, the Americas totally, cumulatively, were now closed to European colonization, and that any further European interference in the Western Hemisphere would be treated as a hostile act against the United States. Okay, that is 1823, early 19th century. That's when the Americans, started this foreign policy, and they pursued this foreign policy vigorously. Initially, they were not very powerful, but eventually, yeah, they were able to impose this all over the Western Hemisphere. So the 2025 national security strategy of the US, this document which has been published, the unclassified version, says that the US is going to revert to the Monroe Doctrine with a Trump corollary on top of it. So what is this Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine? So it's this new interpretation of the Monroe Doctrine. It extends the Monroe Doctrine. It says that the US now has the right, it's going to assert the right to police the Western Hemisphere against extra-regional powers like Europe, China, Russia, whoever else, and even against regional actors like the drug cartels and anyone who indulges in any drug activity, etc. You can allege this about anybody. So by doing this, the US will preserve its dominance over the region, the Western Hemisphere, and it's going to ensure the security of the region. So that is the Trump corollary that has been published last year, just a few months ago. So the Monroe Doctrine is now back in force with an extension called the Trump corollary. So now, what's the justification for the invasion of Venezuela and the regime change that they have effected and the abduction of Maduro, etc.? So it's all about democracy, human rights. The US faces national security threats from Venezuela because of Venezuela's alleged involvement with Hezbollah, with Iran, as well as Russia and China, these two evil nations, right? And of course, there's this Nobel Peace Prize winner, Maria Machado, who is waiting to take over, right? Just like Mohammed Yunus took over in Bangladesh, East Pakistan, right? So that's the narrative. And obviously, Trump has claimed that Venezuela has taken over American oil in some way. So Venezuela, a few years ago, it nationalized the oil industry, okay? But it did not steal anyone's. When you nationalize an industry, it means you buy up all the companies that are operating in that industry in your country. You don't capture the companies, you buy them out. So that's what Venezuela had done. And the oil that exists on Venezuelan territory, how is it American oil? I'm not sure, but that's the justification that Trump has given. So, see, obviously it means that the US actions aren't about democracy, human rights, freedom, peace, etc. It's all about controlling oil. Venezuela accounts for about 20% of the world's proven oil resources. This is about controlling oil. It's about controlling the other resources that you have in Venezuela: lithium, gold, rare earth minerals, etc. Okay, so that's what it's about. So Maduro has been arrested. He will stand trial on criminal charges in the US, and that's the situation. Now, understand the importance and value of Venezuela geopolitically and from a resource perspective, etc. See, Venezuela's share of the world's proven oil resources or reserves is about 18 to 20%. Let's say 1/5 of the entire world's proved oil reserves are in Venezuela. Immensely important, immensely vital. So if in the future, in a few months, let's say the US tries to invade Iran, hypothetically, completely hypothetical scenario, then there could be a major shock in the global oil supply, because Iran is kind of the epicenter. That region, the West Asia region, is the epicenter of the world's oil and energy supplies. Yeah. So if there is an attempted American invasion of Iran, and there's this global oil shock, that oil supplies are disrupted for weeks perhaps, then if the US has Venezuela, then it's going to be secure, and it'll be able to control oil supplies throughout the world. It will be able to decide who gets oil, who doesn't get oil. So that's great. That's fantastic. And so Venezuela, it's about 1/5 of the global oil resources. And the past 5 years, let's say 2020 to 2025, between 65 to 80% of Venezuela's oil exports have gone to China. Okay, 65 to 80%, depending on the year, up and down, up and down. So at the higher end, it's 80% of Venezuela's oil exports going to China. Now, China, China doesn't import oil only from Venezuela, obviously. Russia and Saudi Arabia, these two countries each account for 15 to 20% of China's oil imports. So if Russia is 15 and Saudi Arabia is 15, that's 30%. If it's 2020, it's 40%, that sort of thing. And then you have Malaysia, Iraq, Oman, etc., which also, and if you put Russia and Saudi Arabia in addition to these countries, that's about 2/3 of China's oil imports. So Russia and Saudi Arabia are the top two suppliers for China. Then you have Iraq, UAE, Brazil, Oman, Malaysia, Angola, etc., all these countries. Okay. In Venezuela, Venezuela's share of China's oil imports is about 3 to 5% only, the past 5 years. Okay. But it's still the major place where you have oil reserves. So that's Venezuela and China. Now, what about India? Does Venezuela export oil to India? So in the 2010s, 2010 to 2020, around that time period, roughly, Venezuela provided about 10 to 12% of India's crude oil imports. Okay, so Venezuela was a major oil supplier for India. But then the Americans imposed sanctions, they tightened the sanctions, and this trade came to a complete halt around 2020. Okay, because of US sanctions. And in 2024, India kind of restarted importing a little bit of oil from Venezuela after taking permission from the United States. But it was about 1 to 2% of crude oil imports. Okay, so the US has now essentially, or it's in the process of securing control over Venezuela's oil resources. So this will reduce American vulnerability to any kind of oil energy disruptions in the Gulf. Yeah, it will provide a buffer to the US in case there are supply shocks, if there's a confrontation with Iran or whatever, right? So that's the deal. And this obviously will lower the economic cost of a confrontation with Iran if Washington decides to go down that road. And this will make any kind of military pressure against Iran more economically manageable, even politically manageable. So this is a great, we could say, master stroke of the US. This is going to reinforce, now that the US controls an additional 20% of the world's oil resources, this will now further reinforce the central role of the United States dollar, the US dollar, in energy markets. This will help preserve the petrodollar system that is the backbone of the global financial system and American financial power, right? So that is the deal. That's the deal right now. As of now, it's just been a couple of hours, few hours since this entire thing happened. Now, what about the other nations? Like Argentina Parao asks, what are the other nations that are aligned with Maduro's government? So, which are the nations in Latin America or in the Americas that are aligned with Venezuela? One is, if you want to talk about the core allies, the core ideological and political allies, there's two. One is Cuba, and the other is Nicaragua. Nicaragua is where the US had conducted a regime change, and they had captured, abducted, whatever you want to call it, Manuel Noriega back in the day. So first, Cuba. Cuba is the land of Fidel Castro, and then later his brother Raul Castro. So Cuba has historically provided political support, intelligence support, diplomatic support, etc., to Venezuela. So Cuba has repeatedly affirmed and publicly affirmed full and complete support for Venezuela and Nicolas Maduro. So that's Cuba. What about Nicaragua? So Nicaragua is ruled by Daniel Ortega. Okay, his government, and he's a long-time actor in the region himself, decades. So Daniel Ortega's government regularly supports and consistently supports Venezuela and Maduro. It rejects American sanctions, Western, European, EU sanctions, etc. And it votes with Venezuela on various regional and multilateral forums. And the West regards Nicaragua as part of this authoritarian anti-US gang with Cuba and Venezuela. Okay, the regional anti-American bloc. That's Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua. So that is these two nations. Then you also have some other allies like Bolivia and Honduras. And whenever you have left of center governments in Mexico, in Brazil, in Colombia, they have maintained good relations with Venezuela and Maduro, but they also have not been very consistent, entirely, totally consistent in their support of Venezuela. So some of them, see the 2024 election victory of Maduro, it was disputed by Western nations, and some of these nations did not offer unconditional endorsement of Maduro when he won. So that is the situation. That's the deal. That those are the allies of Venezuela or Maduro in Latin America. So what's going to happen to these countries? That's the question. Is the US going to go and invade them too? Well, you know what? What's the point of invading Cuba? You know what? Cuba has been sitting next door to the US. I mean, just offshore from Florida, if you open the map. And the US never bothered to do a regime change there. Right? And they were able to do a regime change in a couple of hours in Venezuela. So what's the deal? Why did the US never go after Cuba? Well, there's nothing of any real importance in Cuba. The US already has a base on Cuban territory, Guantanamo Bay, right? And there's no oil or any such precious, valuable resource in Cuba. So let Cuba exist and let the, so that's been the kind of approach towards Cuba. And when it comes to the other nations, Bolivia and Nicaragua, etc., once again, there's not a lot that these nations have to offer in terms of resources, etc. So the US will essentially, so the US action in Venezuela is going to serve as an example for everybody else. If you cross the line, this is what happens. If you stand against us, this is what happens. So the other nations will now have to be pragmatic and practical, and they will not really oppose the US too much. And anyway, these small nations, to what extent can they actually, oppose the US in any meaningful way, apart from, moral opposition or verbal opposition? Is there any actual action that they can take that can hurt the US? Not really. So the US essentially is now going to ensure that it completely controls the Western Hemisphere. If there are some dissidents here and there, those will be managed. And this will serve as a reminder to all other nations in the region that you've got to stand, you've got to toe the line. Whatever the US says needs to happen. You can voice some opposition and some dissent here and there, but your actions cannot be in opposition to US interests. So that is the situation right now. And this is a evolving situation. It happened just few hours ago, 3-4 hours ago. So we'll keep a very close eye on this, and this is going to have global repercussions. It is connected to other conflicts in the world. It is connected to Ukraine. It's connected to the West Asia region. It's connected to Israel, Gaza, Iran. It's also connected to Taiwan. Everything is interconnected. So, like I said, the capture essentially of Venezuela gives the US a big buffer against any potential oil shocks, energy shocks that could emanate from West Asia if it tries to do a regime change in Iran. Now, how does Russia respond? How does China respond beyond diplomatic protests, etc.? We'll wait and watch. Yeah, because Russia and China are hard retaliators. They have demonstrated that they are willing, that they're capable of retaliating in a hard, meaningful way, and they're willing to do that. Russia did Ukraine, and China has done all kinds of other things. So let us wait and watch. And we shall revisit this in the same live stream tomorrow in 24 hours' time. Okay, so that's about Venezuela. Very important development. And the US is essentially taking over the Western Hemisphere. It's putting the chess pieces on the board. It's setting the chessboard in the right order so that it can take further action in other parts of the world. Okay. Real Vladimir Putin says, with the recent attack on Putin's house, what's going to happen? Is it to provoke Russia into more decisive action so that they can portray Russia as an aggressor? Well, this entire matter of portraying Russia as an aggressor. Russia started a war with Ukraine, special military operation. They don't respect the sovereignty, integrity of Ukraine, etc. I mean, Venezuela. The US did exactly the same thing in Venezuela. They disregarded international law. What the US has done is a blatant violation of international law. You don't attack a sovereign nation. You've got to respect the nation's territorial integrity and sovereignty. Doesn't matter if the US does it. If Russia does it, very bad, very, very bad. No, bad boy. I mean, what sort of double standards is this? Well, if you are the most powerful nation in the world, you can have any kinds of double standards. Doesn't matter. You have earned the right to be hypocritical. So, see, Russia has already been portrayed as an aggressor, right? So what happened is that Mr. Putin was on a phone call with Mr. Trump, okay, from his residence in Novgorod, if I'm not mistaken. And Trump made sure that the phone call lasts a long time. And the American agencies, etc., CIA, etc., they knew that Mr. Putin is in his residence in Novgorod. And they passed on that information to the Ukrainians, who launched a series of drone strikes on Mr. Putin's residence. It was an assassination attempt. Now the Western media and commentators and analysts are saying that where's the proof of this? The Russians are making a false claim to provoke further action. That's what they're claiming. Yeah. It is what it is. So Mr. Modi has tweeted his very great concern about what's happened. Even other countries have tweeted, leaders of other countries have put out similar statements. So look, from my perspective, there's no question that this thing happened. There are videos of hits, drone hits on the Kremlin and other major Russian places where Mr. Putin generally either works or resides. So the Ukrainians, Mr. Zelensky and his team, they tried to assassinate Mr. Putin. What's going to happen now is the question. So Russia has, first of all, given evidence of this to the United States. And they have said that our retaliation, our response will not be diplomatic, it will be military. So it looks like there's going to be, calculated retaliation to what the Ukrainians have done. It is possible they may even go after Mr. Zelensky. It is possible. Okay. I'm not advocating that they should go after Mr. Zelensky, but I'm saying it's possible, given that Zelensky went after Putin's life. Now I suppose all kinds of cards are on the table now. So what happens now? So we'll have to see. We'll have to wait and watch. There's going to be retaliation from Moscow, military retaliation. What specific retaliation, we'll have to see. Yeah, but this is a major, grave provocation from Ukraine with the help, apparently, of the United States. Yeah, on Moscow. I mean, attempting an assassination of Mr. Putin. Mr. Putin, is he too trusting of the West? Is he under the belief that the West is gentlemanly? I mean, the Minsk Accords. Mr. Putin actually tried to make the Minsk Accords work. And after Madame Angela Merkel retired, she said this in an interview, that the Minsk Accords were simply a ploy to delay. I mean, to buy time. A ploy to buy time so that we can arm Ukraine. And they were sure, the West, that a war will happen. And they were pushing Russia towards a war. They were crossing red line after red line. So the West knew that the war is going to happen. Russia will eventually be forced to take military action. And the Minsk Accords were a ploy to buy time, buy a few years, to delay the Russian military action so that they can bolster Ukraine's military capabilities. And Mr. Putin got played by the Americans, by the West. Mr. Putin got played. He was too trusting. And it's true. Ideally, he should have launched the special military operation in 2014 itself, when it took Crimea. Now, he was on a phone call with Mr. Trump, and he was perhaps under the assumption that Mr. Trump is a gentleman, and we are actually conducting negotiation on the phone. And when I am talking to my colleague in the United States, as gentlemen, we will not do anything against each other while the diplomatic negotiations are happening. But while this is happening, the Americans pass, apparently, information that Mr. Putin is in so-and-so location to the Ukrainians, and they try to assassinate Mr. Putin. So Mr. Putin seems to be not a very trusting person, but yeah, he's kind of trusted the West on a few occasions, and the West has exploited that. I suppose there's no more trust left anymore. So let's see how Russia responds to the attempted assassination of Mr. Putin. I'm sure there's going to be a response, and it's going to be military. We'll see. Hensy Penguin says, why did Russia choose to play the slow war tactic strategy, whatever, against Ukraine? How is it more beneficial for the Kremlin? Yes, so what we are seeing the special military operation was launched in February 2022. And very rapidly, Russian forces were on the outskirts of Kiev, etc., but then they withdrew. And there were massive, very rapid territorial exchanges for a while. Then Russia took over Luhansk, Donetsk, etc., those regions, the Donbas region, which is ethnically Russian majority, and the people there were very badly treated, brutalized for several years by the Ukrainians after 2014 and so on. And now the scenario is that of a slow war, a frozen conflict, a war of attrition, a slow grind, call it whatever you want. That's the situation. So Russia has decided consciously, clearly, to change its strategy to a slow war, an attritional war. Okay? And what is the reason for this? That's a very good question. So this essentially is about weaponizing time. It's about turning time into a weapon. How so is the question. How so? See, Russia is a massive military industrial base, massive industrial base, massive military base, essentially unlimited territory, which means essentially unlimited resources, coal, oil, gas, petroleum, minerals, iron ore, whatever you want to sustain a war, raw materials, they have it. And they have the industries to turn those raw materials into finished products, weapons, munitions, and so on. So if you adopt a slow war strategy, Ukraine is a smaller nation. Ukraine's manpower is much smaller. Russia's population is much larger. Ukraine's economy is smaller. Russia's economy is way larger, etc. So by weaponizing time, by grinding the war out over a long, prolonged period of time, it's going to have the effect of exhausting Ukraine's manpower, exhausting Ukraine's economy, exhausting the West's political will. Because see, Ukraine, if it were fighting with its own resources, it would have lasted a week or two. And then what do you do? Where do the arms, ammunition, funds, etc. come from? They have to come from the West. So the West has been financing this war against Russia, Ukraine's war against Russia, or Russia, Ukraine's defensive war against Russia, whatever you want to call it. Okay? Without Western support, Ukraine would have fallen a long, long time ago. So now, the longer the war goes on, the more it exhausts Western resources, not manpower, but economic resources, financial resources, material resources, political will, right? So Mr. Putin is banking on Russia's larger population. He is banking on Russia's wartime industry, its military industrial complex. And he knows that his nation has the resources to endure a long conflict that can potentially, if required, last years, even a decade or two, right? And Ukraine has constraints that Russia doesn't have: manpower, ammunition, finances, goodwill from the West, etc. Right? So over the past 2-3 years, Russia has been relying on positional warfare. It's relying on the use of heavy artillery. It's relying on methodical assaults along the front lines. And Russia has been willing, and it's actually had a strategy of having slow advances, not rapid and deep advances, slow, shallow advances. In exchange for what? In exchange for lower risk, lower operational risk. And Russia has also been, doing systematic strikes on Ukrainian infrastructure. What kind of infrastructure? Energy infrastructure, logistical infrastructure, industry, etc. And the objective is to erode Ukraine's ability to sustain the war. And what happens when when Ukraine's ability is eroded? Ukraine has to be resupplied from the West over and over again, right? So this is a long-term protracted conflict that we are witnessing now. And this stretches out costs across the EU, across the West, across the Western nations, across NATO, right? It obviously is, there are many nations that are now tired of this war. No one is enthusiastic about this war anymore. So this strategy is increasing pressure on Western unity. It's testing whether the United States and the European allies of Ukraine are willing to sustain large aid packages, and how long they're willing to sustain these, consistently keep giving these aid packages to Ukraine. And what about the domestic support? People are tired in these nations. People are tired of their economies and their taxpayer money financing this war, right? So that's the situation. Essentially, Russia has made a calculated bet that it can sustain high defense spending long enough to outlast Ukraine and the West, right? And see, Russia's economy is doing okay. It's not doing badly. It's doing better than European economies. Russia has reoriented its economy towards a war industry, war footing. It's boosted its production of munitions. If it's boosted its production of artillery shells, drones, armored vehicles, and it's importing materials from its partners such as Iran, North Korea, potentially even China. I mean, Chinese components are being increasingly found in Russian munitions, etc. So that is the situation. Russia is willing to wait as long as it takes until the West loses patience and seeks an end to the war on Russia's terms. What are Russia's terms? The demilitarization of Ukraine, the denazification of Ukraine, and a regime change in Kiev, and the partition of Ukraine along lines that will be decided eventually. So that's the deal. That is the deal. That's why Russia has chosen to play the frozen conflict or slow war strategy against Ukraine. Very beneficial. Makes sense. Mriganka Shekhar Bishwas says, if the US pressures Pakistan to deploy troops in the Gaza Strip, does this not fundamentally contradict Israel's security interests, given Pakistan's military and domestic ecosystem is widely sympathetic to Hamas? How would Asim Munir manage an overwhelmingly anti-Israel domestic audience? And if Israeli strikes kill Pakistani soldiers, does Pakistan prioritize obedience to Washington or regime legitimacy at home? Is Pakistan now caught in a strategic crossfire? And how do you see this dilemma realistically playing out for Pakistan's military and regional positioning? And real Vladimir Putin says, with the recent talk about Pakistani soldiers in Gaza, what's the update in the relationship between Israel and Pakistan? Okay. So, first of all, what is the situation right now? Pakistan, as we know, is not anymore a newly minted US vassal. It's been a US vassal since 2022, mid roughly 2022, when Imran Khan was ousted and Shehbaz Sharif was placed in that seat of prime minister. Right? So, what has Pakistan said about Gaza? Pakistan has said that it is willing, in principle, whatever it means, to join President Donald Trump's Gaza peace plan. Okay, so the US has proposed that a US-backed international stabilization force will act as a peacekeeping mission in Gaza. Okay, so Pakistan has said that we are willing, in principle, to participate in this. I don't know what in principle means, but it essentially means that we will do what we are told by our boss, the United States, by President Trump. Whatever he says, we shall do. So, in the near term, I'm not sure when this entire thing will eventuate, this peacekeeping force in Gaza or the international stabilization force, but Pakistan is very likely to be one of the first nations to join this peacekeeping mission. Okay, and they have said that we will do this. Our mandate, the Pakistanis have said, I believe, that our mandate is limited to monitoring the ceasefire, to protecting civilians, and humanitarian support. Yeah, and they have said that there should be no explicit requirement to disarm Hamas. Apparently, well, it doesn't work without disarming Hamas. That's the core objective of Israel. You know, the complete disarmament of Hamas and the expulsion of Hamas from Gaza. So I'm not sure how it works, but that is what Pakistan has said. Now the situation is, what about Israel? Yeah, how does Asim Munir convince his overwhelmingly anti-Israel domestic audience that this is fine? And what if Israeli strikes kill Pakistani soldiers? Well, first of all, the Pakistanis have provided such service in the past also in West Asia. Zia-ul-Haq, the former Pakistani dictator, what did he do? He killed Palestinians, didn't he? He led a Pakistani force in Jordan. Let's Google this. Zia-ul-Haq, Jordan civil war. So what did he do there? He played a significant role as a brigadier in the Jordanian Civil War of 1970, Black September. He was, etc., etc. King Hussein of Jordan gave Zia command of the Jordanian Army 2nd Division. Zia led troops in battles, helped guide tanks, was involved in planning and execution of counteroffensive against the PLO and Palestinian Fedayins, was instrumental in military operations, etc. And they ended up killing about 25,000 Palestinians, the Pakistanis. Okay, that's what Zia-ul-Haq did. So now it looks like Asim Munir may have to play possibly some kind of a role, maybe not what Zia did, but some kind of peacekeeping, etc. role in the region. Now, how can he convince his domestic audience? Well, he will say that, what, we are actually serving the people of Gaza. We're going to ensure that there is no violence against the people of Gaza. We're going to ensure that President Trump, who is this great divine character, the peace plan that he has proposed is the best plan in the world. And we're going to ensure that the peace plan is implemented. And there's no more suffering for the people of Gaza. And there's no more killing of the people of Gaza. That sort of thing he can say. And, well, the Pakistani public will lap it up, most likely. once again, the question again is, what's the relationship between Israel and Pakistan? That's the core question you're asking here, clearly. Well, that's a good question. See, the United States is Israel's number one supporter. It has always consistently offered unconditional support to Israel. We know that. Yes. The US also has a vassal state in the form of Pakistan. Pakistan is a vassal state of the US. So that means that Pakistan and Israel should kind of be on the same page, on the same side, right? It does kind of mean that they're actually, in some sense, allies. Yes. Pakistan doesn't officially recognize Israel. Pakistan says verbally all kinds of nasty stuff about Israel, but from action perspective, from the perspective of actions, not words, what does Pakistan do that hurts Israel? Essentially nothing, right? Of course, Pakistani terrorist activities have ended up targeting Israeli citizens. For example, 2008 Mumbai, the Mumbai attacks were carried out by Pakistani terrorists, and they specifically targeted Israeli civilians. So yeah, that was one instance where Pakistanis targeted Israelis, but on Indian territory. Apart from that, there's no other instance I can think of where Pakistan has gone after Israeli interests. Verbal support, etc., that carries no weight in my book. So Pakistan and Israel are going to find a way to get along. Yeah, and if Israeli strikes kill Pakistani soldiers, well, that's a hypothetical. If it happens, the Pakistanis will find some way of ensuring that it doesn't cause too much damage from a public opinion perspective at home. So Pakistan doesn't serve Israel. Pakistan serves Washington. Washington and Israel are on the same page, which means Pakistan and Israel are also essentially on the same page. Okay, Mriganka Shekhar Biswas says, does Israel's move towards recognizing Somaliland signal a calculated attempt to secure leverage over the Red Sea and counter Houthi movement disruptions? Or is there a broader strategic realignment at play, especially given strong opposition from the US and major European powers? Additionally, how does Somaliland's largely Islamic society reconcile political support for Israel in the current regional and ideological climate? And Karthik says, could you provide some history and context about Somaliland and why Israel chose to recognize it? And why are all the other major countries criticizing this move, Somaliland? So first of all, let's go to the map. We haven't opened the map today, so let's do that. Where is Somaliland? And is it in a geographically interesting location? So we are here. We know where India is. Now we go westwards. And west of India, we have, along the Horn of Africa, a nation called Somalia. The capital is Mogadishu. If you go northwards, there is a city called Hargeisa, which is part of Somalia, but it's actually the capital of Somaliland, a de facto nation. So let us search for Somaliland. And then Google Maps will show us this region. As you can see, this shaded region, which is a de facto separate nation. It is not controlled by the government in Mogadishu, the Somalian government. I mean, whatever government exists, it's a de facto separate nation. So that's the situation. Now, as you can see, this nation is located essentially at the mouth of the Red Sea. Between the Gulf of Aden and the Red Sea, you have this choke point, extremely important geographic choke point, the Strait of Bab al-Mandeb. Okay? And Djibouti is the nation that is the nation at the choke point. The other one is Yemen, South Yemen. And then we have Somaliland. And of course, you have Eritrea also over here, Asmara. Eritrea is kind of aligned with the West. So Djibouti is also, you could say, aligned with the West. And if Somaliland becomes aligned with the West, then they can control the entire region through the use of these territories. And if they can create a separate nation called South Yemen, for example, which is controlled by the West or by Western allies in the region, well, then the entire choke point is completely controlled, and you can choke off at in on demand, supplies going eastwards towards China. If you can do the same thing, if the West can, for example, overthrow the Iranian regime, the government in Tehran, and bring the blessings of democracy and human rights to Iran, then they can also control the Strait of Hormuz. And by doing that, they can blockade China. See, we in India talk about blockading the Strait of Malacca. The Americans don't worry about Malacca. They will blockade Bab al-Mandeb over here, and they will blockade Hormuz in case they are able to overthrow the government in Tehran and install a puppet regime. If they can do that, they can seriously squeeze China without ever having to go near Malacca. That's how the US thinks. India thinks of Malacca. The US thinks of Bab al-Mandeb and Hormuz and other things as well. So now that we understand that Somaliland sits in a very interesting geographical and geopolitically sensitive location, that's the first thing we have to understand. Now let's talk about the history of Somaliland. Okay? So the capital of Somaliland, like I said, is Hargeisa, that city in the north. Somaliland, what is it? And how is it a separate de facto country? So Somaliland is a self-governing breakaway region in that region northwest of Somalia, like we saw on the map. It operates as a de facto independent state. And until very recently, it had no formal international recognition. It's not a UN member state, for example. Yeah. So Somaliland has its own constitution. It has an elected president. It has a parliament. It has a government. It has a judiciary. It has an army, security forces. They have their own currency, the Somaliland shilling, and they hold separate elections from Somalia. I'm not sure if there are elections in Somalia, but Somaliland has elections. Okay. So it functions separately from Somalia from a political perspective and administrative perspective. Somaliland has not been governed from Mogadishu since 1991. They run their own domestic affairs. They run their own external affairs. So this is a classic de facto state. Now, how did this happen is the question. As always, we have to go back a few decades and understand the history. And when we talk about history, we're going to talk about European colonization. All these issues, all these problems, the root cause goes back to European colonization. So from the late 19th century until 1960, this place called Somaliland was ruled by Britain. The British called it a protectorate, whatever it means. Okay? And they ruled the place. It was called British Somaliland. Further south, the Italians ruled a place called Italian Somaliland, which is today's Somalia. Okay? To the south. So in the north, you had British Somaliland. In the south, you had Italian Somaliland. These were two separate colonial territories with different administration and different administration styles and legacies and so on. Okay. So 1960, I said, right? So 1960, British Somaliland became independent. It became the state of Somaliland. It was recognized by more than 30 nations, okay, including permanent members of the UN Security Council. But this situation lasted only a few days. The same year, the southern state of Somaliland, it became independent, and the northern state of Somaliland voluntarily united with the former Italian-ruled territory, which had just gained independence. So this formed Somalia, or the Somali Republic, and the capital was in Mogadishu, down south. Then in the 1960s and 70s, you had, the people of northern Somaliland, okay, they started getting the sense that they were being marginalized by Mogadishu. Okay, the political and economic center of gravity is actually a term, yeah, that was in Mogadishu, in the south. And it was the southern elites who were ruling everything, and the northerners were marginalized. Then in 1969, there was a coup in Mogadishu. It brought to power a fine gentleman named Siad Barre. Siad Barre. Let's see what this fine gentleman looked like, shall we? Siad Barre. So he was a dictator. Mohammed Siad Barre. He was a military officer, obviously, and he was the president of Somalia from 69 all the way until 1991. Right? So Siad Barre comes to power. Siad Barre comes to power in Mogadishu, and he is obviously a dictator, authoritarian rule, and his treatment of the northern part of Somalia, which is Somaliland, it obviously deepened the grievances that the people of the region had, and he repressed them, etc. His policies were very nasty, brutal, whatever you want to say. So then this launched a movement to bring independence to Somaliland in the 1980s, early 1980s. So an armed rebellion was launched against the regime of Siad Barre. And Siad Barre's military forces devastated the northern cities. Bombardment and all kinds of human rights things, and standard atrocities that you have in these countries and so on. So large numbers of civilians were killed. Many people had to run away, flee into exile. And this experience that the people of the northern region had at the hands of Siad Barre and his military regime, that is central to the justification of Somaliland, that that the union with the South was intolerable and it had to go. So in 1991, Siad Barre's regime collapsed. Okay, and the central Somali state down south, ruled from the south in Mogadishu, it disintegrated. There was no government anymore. Okay, you had different factions in different regions, different warlords and different pirates and God knows what. I think there was a person called Mohammed Farah Aidid who was ruling Mogadishu, and he fought the US for a while. Clinton was the president, yeah, that sort of thing. So you had different factions in different regions who asserted control, and the north came under the influence of the Somaliland independence movement people. So in 1991, the people of the northern region, Somaliland, they declared independence. They said that the 1960 Union had effectively ended, and they proclaimed that the Republic of Somaliland was now in existence within the borders of the former British occupied territory, the British protectorate of British Somaliland. So they said that this was not a secession from Somalia, but a restoration of independence. Okay, we had voluntarily merged with Somalia, but we were treated brutally. We were oppressed, and now we are withdrawing and we are restoring the independence that was rightfully ours. Yeah, so that union was failed. It was unlawful. It was oppressive, and we have exited from it. So that was in 1991, right? And then they formed a constitution, I think in 2001. They drafted a constitution. There was a referendum which adopted the constitution, and Somaliland was reconfirmed that it was independent, and its political system was enshrined in the constitution, like we in India like to say, a presidential system, a legislator with an upper house and a lower house. The lower house was a house of representatives that would be elected. The upper house would be an unelected house of elders, like an Indian Rajya Sabha kind of thing. Yeah, and there was a limit of 3 political parties to ensure that there is not too much fragmentation in the country and all that. So that is how Somaliland was formed. It became separate from Somalia, de facto separate. So there is something called the Montevideo criteria. Okay, a sovereign nation has a defined territory. It has its own population. It has its own government. It has its own capability to run its own economy and international relations and so on and so forth. So Somaliland, it satisfies all the so-called Montevideo criteria, and yet it has remained largely unrecognized. by other nations. The African Union doesn't recognize Somaliland. Many other nations don't recognize Somaliland. So, what is the reason for that? The African Union fears that if we recognize Somaliland, it will encourage other secessionist movements in the region, in Africa, and it will undermine Africa's norm of respecting colonial borders. So, Africa has this norm that we will respect colonial borders. I don't know why they have this norm. They should disrespect, in my opinion, all colonial borders. But Africa has a norm. So that's called colonization, mental colonization. So Africa has the norm of respecting colonial borders. And if we recognize Somaliland, then it will encourage other secessionist movements and so on and so forth. And it will undermine the norm of respecting colonial borders. Actually, in the case of Somaliland, you're actually respecting the old colonial borders, but whatever. That sort of thing. And Somalia opposes the partition, right? And there are various nations, especially Western nations, that engage with Somaliland through liaison offices or whatever they call the technical cooperation, but they don't recognize the country. For example, the US. The US has intermittently used the Somaliland territory for counter-terrorism operations, counter-terrorism cooperation, maritime security arrangements in the Gulf of Aden, etc. But they don't recognize Somaliland. Ethiopia is a long-term, ally of Somaliland. Now let's once again revisit the map to understand why. Okay, where is map? We bring map. Let's understand why Ethiopia is an ally, you could say, of Somaliland. So zoom in. So there was a time when the country of Eritrea was part of Ethiopia, but then they broke free and they formed a separate country. And that had the effect of landlocking Ethiopia. Ethiopia became a landlocked country. They don't have access to the Indian Ocean. They don't have access to the Gulf of Aden. They don't have access to the Red Sea. Terrible. So that is the situation that was imposed upon Ethiopia. So what did Ethiopia do to, let's say, remedy this situation? What Ethiopia did is that it cultivated close economic and security ties with Somaliland, and Ethiopia has been for a long time using Somaliland's Berbera port as an outlet to the sea. Ethiopia needs access to the sea. So they're using the Berbera port of Somaliland as this port of access to the sea. And in 2024, Ethiopia and Somaliland signed a memorandum of understanding that would give Ethiopia access to a naval facility near Berbera. And the promise was that we will give recognition, official recognition to Somaliland. And this caused a crisis, diplomatic crisis between Ethiopia and Somalia, that sort of thing. The UAE is also involved in Somaliland. They have secured a deal to operate the Berbera port, develop and operate the Berbera port through a UAE-based company. And they potentially may build a military facility or air base over there. So the UAE is involved in Somaliland's economic infrastructure and also security infrastructure. Saudi Arabia is also involved in various ways, religious, economic cooperation, security channels, livestock trade, countering extremism, etc. So Saudi Arabia is also aligning its Somaliland into its Horn of Africa, foreign policy. And the objective is to counter Iranian influence and so on and so forth. Now, with all of that understood, okay, that's the history. Now, a week or so ago, Israel became the first nation to formally recognize the Republic of Somaliland as an independent and sovereign country. And they signed a joint declaration of mutual recognition with the president of Somaliland. Mutual recognition means Israel recognizes Somaliland and Somaliland recognizes Israel, right? And now there is news that maybe India may be on the way of towards recognizing Somaliland potentially, yeah, that sort of thing. So that is the situation. Okay, that's the situation. So why has Israel chosen to recognize it? Because of the incredibly valuable, important geographical position, location. Right? Israel has faced a lot of problems from the Ansar Allah faction in Yemen, the so-called Houthis, and the West wants to control the Strait of Bab al Mandeb. So you control Somaliland, you control Djibouti, you control Eritrea. That gives you one half of the puzzle. And if you can create a separate nation in Yemen, maybe South Yemen or something, that is aligned with the West, then that is a done deal then. So slowly but steadily, all the pieces on the chessboard are falling into place. So that's why Israel has done this. It's important for Israel that they are able to control this region. And that's important for the US as well. Right. Ayush Singh says, you mentioned that the US in future will be moving towards hemispheric defense. But there is no sign of US withdrawal from Asia. In fact, it's making its presence even stronger than before. For example, recent 11 billion weapons sales to Taiwan, etc. What's my opinion? Okay. So the US a few months ago came out with this new national security strategy, right? And once again, let me repeat, it involves the Monroe Doctrine and the Trump Corollary. What is the Monroe Doctrine? So that we understand what we're talking about. The Monroe Doctrine was a policy, US foreign policy from 1823. It said that the Americas were closed to any further European colonization or any other interference. Any European interference in the Western Hemisphere, in the Americas, would henceforth be treated as a hostile act against the United States. So the US let down a red line that no external interference will now be allowed in the Western Hemisphere. And they enforce it eventually through military force, military strength. So that's the Monroe Doctrine. Now, the National Security Strategy 2025 talks about the Trump Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. So it's a contemporary, modern 21st century reinterpretation. It extends the idea of the Monroe Doctrine. It says that the US now has the right, it's going to assert the right to be the super cop, the policeman in the Western Hemisphere. The US will police the Western Hemisphere. It's going to police the Western Hemisphere against extra regional powers like China, Russia, whoever else wants to influence the region, no longer allowed. You all get out, right? And it will also police the region against regional actors such as drug cartels, etc. And the objective is to preserve US dominance and in the region and to preserve security in the region. So this is an imperial policy. The US is now acting as a classical empire. This is our domain. You're all our vassals, and we're gonna police you all. You guys better not, get out of line. And nobody else from outside is allowed to, have any influence or any interference in the region. So that's the national security strategy. So the national security strategy, it does explicitly recenter American strategy on the Western Hemisphere. Okay, it says that American preeminence, American dominance, American hegemony in the Western Hemisphere is a basic condition, a central condition for America's national security and prosperity. Okay, it says that. So it revives the Monroe Doctrine. It adds the Trump Corollary to it. It says that the US will assert and enforce its hegemony in the region in whatever words it uses. Yeah, it's my words I'm using, but it has the same meaning. It's going to deny external powers, which means non-Western Hemisphere powers, any strategic foothold or military foothold in the region. Okay, and this national security strategy says that the US needs to readjust its global military posture away from regions whose relevance may have declined for US for US interests, and the US will now reorient its posture towards its missions in the Western Hemisphere. Okay, so what are the elements of this? First of all, Europe is being downgraded. America's ties with Europe are being downgraded. Europe is now expected to shoulder much more of the financial burden of its security. See, the US is part of NATO. It is the hegemonic power in NATO. And the other nations are all apart from Canada, are all in Western Europe. Yeah, mostly. And the US has been financing NATO for the most part. all these years. And now the US requires that European nations must double their expenditure towards NATO from 2.5% to 5% by about 2030, around that time. So the Europeans are now expected to put shoulder much more of the burden of NATO, right? So Europe is being downgraded. And not just Europe, it's EMEA. There's this region called EMEA in business parlance. EMEA means Europe, Middle East, and Africa. Okay, so this entire region, Europe, Middle East, Africa, EMEA, is being downgraded, and the US is now going to focus on hemispheric defense. It's going to prioritize its hemispheric defense over its global forward presence. Now, please understand that it is not just black and white. It sounds like the US is completely retreating, but it is not. The US, the National Security Strategy document, it still treats China and Russia as major adversaries. Okay, and it is linking the hemispheric security to global great power competition. So the strategy doesn't say that we need to give up all our tools for projecting power outside of the Western Hemisphere. It doesn't say that we need to shut down all our extraterritorial military bases. The US has more than 700 or 800 extraterritorial military bases beyond its territory. Many of them are in the Eastern Hemisphere, right? 130 roughly of them are in Japan. More than 100 are in South Korea. Is the US going to shut that down? Absolutely not. Okay, so the US strategy is going to continue to maintain those tools for projecting power in the Eastern Hemisphere. Okay, and they're going to be open to using military force wherever required. So the policy is hemisphere first, not hemisphere only. They're going to prioritize the Western Hemisphere, but they're not withdrawing as such from the Eastern Hemisphere. They want to reduce the potential of overstretching themselves, right? And they want to preserve their capacity to compete globally from a stronger position in the Western Hemisphere. That is the deal. So the US is not giving up on its global influence. It's not giving up on the alliances and vassal arrangements it has across the world. It's not giving up any of that. It's not giving up any of its power projection capabilities. It's reordering the way it approaches the problems it faces in the world. It's not abolishing any of the roles it currently plays. So its position in the Western Hemisphere is now going to be, you could say, a neo-imperial posture. They can see the effect of that right away. A few years ago, they took over Venezuela. Right? It's going to be a muscular approach in the Western Hemisphere. And outside, it's going to shift the burden to its vassals. So the vassals will shoulder more of the burden, and the US will lose none of its power projection capabilities. So that is the situation. Right? It's more nuanced than simply withdrawing into the Western Hemisphere and hemispheric defense. Real Vladimir Putin says, what's your opinion on the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi claiming that China mediated between India and Pakistan in the three-day war? Well, China thinks that, you know what, Trump has been claiming that they have mediated and they have ended the war. So why not we also make some claims? What's my opinion? My opinion is that we don't need to take it seriously. Yeah, we don't have to take it seriously. The Chinese were aiding Pakistan in real time, supplying Pakistan with real-time information, intelligence, satellite imagery, and whatnot during the three-day war, Operation Sindoor, right? So while they are actively aiding Pakistan, you think they'll be in a position to come and mediate? When you take sides, you can't mediate, right? You can't. So this Chinese claim is a joke, and we should treat it as a joke. We should not take it seriously. It's funny kind of. Ayush Singh says, we are hearing constant conversations of a nuclear Japan, which was unheard of since the Second World War. Henry Kissinger had predicted this years ago, and there's a video of mine on this topic. Now that things are evolving at such a rapid pace, could you please tell the story of effects it will have, power balance in East Asia? Will that change? And so on. So, a while ago, a few months ago, I had put out this tweet. Let's put that on the screen. Okay. And this is a quote by Shri Henry Kissinger ji. that Japan is heading towards becoming a nuclear power in 5 years. He said this in 2023. And 2023 is the year that he tragically passed away at the age of 100. He was a great global statesman, and no one understood global diplomacy and geostrategy, etc. Uh, Very few people understood it the way he did, because he was part of it for so many decades. So he said in 2023 that Japan is heading towards becoming a nuclear weapons power in 5 years. So that gives us the end state in 2028. So according to what he says, what he said, Japan, if things go as per his prediction, Japan should become a nuclear weapon state by 2028. This is 2026. Today is January 3, 2026. We've got 3 years, 26, 27, 28. In 3 years, will Japan become a nuclear weapon state? So I spoke about the US national security strategy. It is now focusing primarily on the Western Hemisphere. It's consolidating its new imperial muscular stature, muscular policy in the Western Hemisphere. And in the Eastern Hemisphere, it is forcing its vassals to shoulder much of the economic and military burden of which of their defense, military defense, and of supporting American bases and American power projection capabilities. That's what the US is doing. Now, when it comes to the Far East, Japan, South Korea. Japan and South Korea are two major American vassals. These two nations have been under permanent US military occupation for decades. Japan since 1945, South Korea since the 1950s. Now, does it make sense for the US allowing Japan to acquire nuclear weapons? Well, things are changing very rapidly this year. Let's say Venezuela has fallen. Venezuela is now the property of the US. Hypothetically, if sometime later this year or the next 2 years, the Americans take out Iran, then China there'll be a tremendous amount of pressure on China, because Iran is one nation from which China acquires a lot of oil, energy. And if the US controls that, well. And China has a 25-year strategic agreement with Iran. So China loses a major ally if Iran goes. In that case, China will be very tempted to go after Taiwan. Maybe Taiwan may happen irrespective of that. So in that case, it makes sense for Japan to be way more powerful than it is right now, but still under US control. So, that from that perspective, it may make sense for the Americans to allow Japan to become a controlled nuclear power in such a way that you position nuclear weapons on Japanese soil, but you retain the control. The big red button is in Washington, not in Tokyo. That sort of nuclear weapons power. So essentially, American nukes on Japanese soil, which you could say makes Japan, a place where you have nuclear weapons, if not a nuclear weapons power. That may be very tempting for the US, right? Especially if China becomes desperate or whatever, and they, do some saber rattling, make some moves. So it will significantly change the balance of power in East Asia for sure. See, right now, China has to worry about India because of its own actions. India has no desire to be the enemy of China, an adversary of China. It is China that is acting in an adversarial fashion, which is why India has had to take various measures to ensure its national security. One of the measures is a nuclear triad: land-based, air-based, and sea-based offensive nuclear capability. Right? We have nuclear submarines. We have ballistic missiles. We have air-based, nuclear deterrent that's air-based and ground-based as well. And we have a reasonably good quantity of nuclear warheads. So all of that is to ensure that China doesn't do anything stupid. So China has that to worry about. Now, if Japan also becomes a nuclear power, then China has to worry about two nuclear weapons powers. Pakistan can also potentially be used against China because Pakistan is controlled by the US. So you see, the headaches that China faces could multiply rapidly. If you bring South Korea again into the picture and station nuclear weapons there as well, China gets encircled. And it's not like China is on very friendly terms with Russia. China treats Russia as a junior partner. So Making Japan a nuclear weapons power will significantly alter the balance of power in East Asia. And yeah, it does make sense from a strategic perspective. So we'll see if Mr. Kissinger was right or not. We were 3 years in which we can either prove or disprove his claim, his prediction, let's say. Real Vladimir Putin says, two nations, Iran and India. Iran is facing a lot of sanctions. Iran is a much smaller economy than India, much more inferior military hard power than India. Yet it funds a lot of proxies in the Middle East. India, being such a much larger economy, being the fourth most strongest military power, doesn't do any of that. Why? Why? See, Iran is nowhere compared to India on the hard power scale. Nowhere. Yeah. Iran doesn't have nuclear weapons. Iran is a small economy. Iran is a small conventional military compared to India. And yet Iran projects power across West Asia. Let's go to the map. Give me a second. Let me bring the map on the screen. Okay. Iran projects power in large regions of West Asia. See, Iran projects power in Iraq. At least 50% of Iraq's population is Shia Muslim, and Iran is a Shia Muslim nation. So Iran is able to project power in Iraq. Until last year, Iran had an ally in Syria. Now you have an Al-Qaeda government in Syria, so that's over. Iran has friends in Lebanon. Iran is able to project power in Lebanon as well. And Iran is able to project power in Yemen as well, because its ally is the Ansar Allah faction, the Houthis. So Iran has plenty of power projection capabilities in the region. Iran also, let's not forget, has an ally in Armenia. Iran is an ally of Armenia. A Shia Muslim nation is an ally of a Christian nation in the Caucasus region, and the other ally is a Hindu nation, India. Very interesting scenario over there. So Iran, despite being much weaker than India, projects so much power in West Asia. Right? It's able to fund proxies. It's able to have those proxies work on its behalf, and geopolitically, geostrategically, and so on. So that's why when people talk about the powerful nations, they talk about the US, China, Russia, Iran, North Korea. No one talks about India. India historically has been a soft state, a punching bag. Pakistan keeps punching, jabbing. India just keeps absorbing it. Doesn't even fight back. Doesn't even defend itself, right? That was the situation until 2014. Now it's kind of different, but we still aren't that kind of nation where we are funding proxies across the board and having them fight on our behalf. One reason is that Iran is an Islamic nation in an Islamic neighborhood. And wherever in West Asia, in whichever nation or whichever region you have Shia Muslim populations, there's going to be an affinity between them and Iran. And Iran is able to weaponize that. So Iran has never been a punching bag. Iran has never been a soft state. It's been a very hard state. It kind of punches above its stature. It punches up. India historically hasn't punched at all, except once or twice and then sit down again. Iran also has the advantage of political continuity, political stability. Since 1979, the same government, right? So there's long-term execution of policies, and that's why they've been able to cultivate things long-term. And Iran is a geopolitically ambitious nation. Iran regards itself as the leader of the Islamic world. Iran doesn't regard itself as a nation who will follow someone. We will lead. We were once a great empire. We are an ancient nation. Who are you all to talk to us? We should lead you. We will lead you. So that's the attitude Iran has. India is the most ancient civilization of all. But the Indian government is a colonial government. The entire structure is colonial. India is defined as a secular nation. India's official policy dissociates itself from our civilizational status. The Indian government and the Indian machinery regards India as a nation state, not as a civilization state. And that's why, and in India, we have democracy, which means every 5 years at least, you're going to have potential change of government. And you've had lots of changes of government in the past. Before 2014, you had coalition governments where there's a coalition government, there's essentially nothing happens. And governments come and go, come and go, come and go. That's all. So there's no political stability, there's no continuity of policies and so on. That's why India has never had a long-term proper policy. It's only right now, the past since 2014, that we have had the same prime minister, that we've had a focus and a clear direction and clear focus on what our policy should be. And yet India, and so if you want to have proxies who operate for you, you have to cultivate them for a long time. You can't cultivate proxies around the world in 3 years, even 10 years. It takes time. And see, India doesn't have the advantages that Iran has. Even if it is now geopolitically ambitious, even if it may now be geopolitically ambitious, we don't have the advantages the Iranians have, which is all the Shia populations in West Asia, right? Who are often oppressed by the other populations where they live. If they are minorities, which will obviously make them easier to weaponize by Iran. We don't have any such thing. We have Hindu diasporas and all, but Hindus are not a political people, right? Hinduism is not a political religion. And even if Hindus are oppressed, the government doesn't care. So it's a combination of various factors, right? So that's why India acts very differently from Iran. Nirvana Shank says, Chanakya emphasized pragmatism, strategy, and moral flexibility. How can his Arthashastra principles be applied to India's modern governance and foreign policy? Right. So the Arthashastra is a vast, vast text. You cannot boil it down or distill it down to like 3 principles. But yeah, pragmatism, strategy, moral flexibility, all these are, principles that Chanakya did write about. Now, when it comes to this one here, moral flexibility, what do we mean by that? Moral flexibility. Does it mean that you can do anything, any nasty thing, and it's okay? Be morally flexible? It doesn't mean that. Moral flexibility means if you have a good long-term objective that is genuinely good for your nation, for your people, then to achieve that good objective, it is okay to sometimes be morally flexible. Let's say your objective is the long-term security and prosperity and national integrity of the nation and its people. That is a worthwhile objective to have. So in the pursuit of that objective, you can sometimes be morally flexible. That's what Vishnugupta Chanakya said. You may sometimes wage an unjust war potentially against somebody. Okay? See, if you're the king, you only serve your people. You don't serve the people of the rest of the world. So your only job is to serve your people and do everything that is in their interest. If you can achieve their interest at the expense of somebody else's interests, then it's okay. That's what Vishnugupta Chanakya said. That's called moral flexibility. So these principles are applied in the real world, not by us, but by everybody else. Pakistan has historically been better than India at using Chanakyan principles. What the US does is pure Chanakyan realpolitik, isn't it? Purely. Their policy is completely amoral. I'm not saying immoral, I'm saying amoral. That's what the US policy is. I mean, today they took out Maduro in Venezuela. Today, a couple of hours ago, 4 hours ago. They are doing, and is it good for Venezuela? They're going to essentially turn Venezuela into a vassal state. And the only real reason why they want Venezuela is because it's home to 20% of the world's proven oil reserves. That's it. It's a golden goose. What happens to its people, etc., who cares? What about human rights, freedom, democracy? Who cares? So that's what the US does. So all these principles, India can also use them in the pursuit of its own national interests. When it comes to let's say, domestic politics in India, don't you see moral flexibility all the time? Don't you see the same set of principles being applied in domestic politics, in state level politics, district level politics, national level politics? Don't various political parties routinely absorb individuals who are members of other political parties? But just because I want your constituency and your votes, I'll make you a member of my party. I'll even give you a cabinet position potentially sometimes. You may have been a member of my opposition party, but now that you're part of my party, I'll give you some perks and rewards as long as you deliver the results I want. That's called moral flexibility. What happened to the party's ideology? Well, we're going to make sure that they will become part of our ideology and they'll adhere to our ideology. And we are doing all this. Maybe it may sound a little not very nice, but we're doing this for the right reasons. So that's the justification that certain political parties or politicians will give. And if they are doing the right thing for the these things for the right reasons, well, maybe it makes sense. So, and when it comes to governance, well, we can learn a lot about taxation, etc., from the Arthashastra, the right way to do taxation. I mean, just one tax should be enough. We don't need all these different tax slabs and blah, 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 blah. Taxation upon taxation upon taxation. You already paid income tax. Now, with the little money that's left after paying income tax, on top of that, from that money, you have to pay road tax and this tax and that tax and GST and whatnot. I mean, why? Just have one single tax on everybody. Make it as simple as possible. Don't overburden people with taxes. Don't underburden them either. The government runs on taxation, so taxation is legitimate. Everybody will pay. But make it simple. It looks like the tax department, a lot of it exists just as an employment generation scheme to keep people employed. Why do we need that? So there's a lot we can learn from the Arthashastra to keep things simple, about law and order, about geopolitics, about geostrategy, about engaging with allies and adversaries, about power projection, so many things. And the other nations, they do it. They do what Vishnugupta Chanakya said, wrote about. We are kind of catching up now. Swapnil Mishra says, it's often said that we are living in the most difficult times today, with geopolitical instability, economic inequality, climate change, social unrest, but compared to some of the most devastating periods in human history. 536 to 540 AD, the volcanic winter and plague of Justinian. 1347 to 1351, the Black Death in Europe. 1939 to 1945, the Second World War. Compared to these periods, can we truly consider today the worst era? Why or why not? We are actually living in a very good era. There are some parts of the world where people are obviously facing terrible circumstances. A lot of Africa is like that. See, when we discuss the world, we kind of disregard Africa, right? But Africa is part of the world. But overall, if you look at Eurasia, if you look at the Americas, North and South America, if you look at Oceania, Australia, etc., if you look at China, Russia, Japan, all these countries, there's relative prosperity everywhere. There's no major war that's happening. Ukraine is a like we discussed, a frozen conflict. Apart from Ukraine, apart from the situation in Sudan, etc., in Africa, it's always, yeah. But apart from that, there's no major devastating disaster that's happening right now. There's been no major devastating war since 1945. Okay, Korea happened, sure. Iran, Iraq happened, sure. But these were localized conflicts. The 4 India-Pakistan wars happened, again, localized conflicts. India-China, again, no localized conflict. There's been no major devastation. There's been no major pandemic since 1918. I mean, well, we had one recently, which was kind of not nice, to put it mildly, but it did not have anything near the effect that you had in the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic. The coronavirus was nothing like that. Mortality rate was much lower, death toll was much lower, and so on. So overall, you had many periods of time in the world where things were way, way, way worse than what we have today. Of course, there's geopolitical instability. That's always part of the menu. Right now, it's more than usual, but it is what it is. Economic inequality. There's always economic inequality. Inequality is a feature of the universe. It's a feature, it's a permanent feature of existence, inequality. Every nation, no matter how prosperous, is going to have inequality. But what you need is social mobility, which means that, okay, it's an unequal world, can't do a thing about that. But let's say someone's poor. They should have the means to become prosperous. If you're poor, you should not be condemned to poverty for the rest of your life. If the society that you live in gives you the means and the avenues for bettering your standard status in life, then it's a fair society. Inequality is going to be there. Yeah. So inequality, what's the big deal? I mean, it's always been there. Climate change, the climate has always changed. There's always been climate change. Social unrest, I can show you periods of time when you had tremendous social unrest. Nothing, I mean, way more compared to today. So, we are actually living in one of the most prosperous times, prosperous periods of history in the world. If you're living outside Africa, if you're in Africa, well, I'm sorry to say, yeah, things are bad there. Yeah. But yeah, in the West, especially when they discuss the world, they don't talk about Africa because of what they've done to it. So anyway, if you disregard the situation in Africa, many parts of Africa, then overall things are good. And even in Africa, things are kind of better than in the 19th century when the Europeans destroyed Africa, devastated Africa. So it's not that bad in Africa also. So this is not the worst era. I do not consider this to be the worst era by a long stretch, not at all. Okay, now we'll discuss some history questions. Amisha says, what is the history behind the migration of Indians to the Caribbean? Can it be regarded as slavery? Well, it was called indentured labor. So if you go to the Caribbean region today, the West Indies, where is it? Let's go to the map. So the West Indies is in the Atlantic Ocean, okay, between North and South America, in the Caribbean Sea. All these islands here are the West Indies, the Caribbean region. You have Cuba, you have Hispaniola, which is Haiti in the Dominican Republic, you have Puerto Rico over here, and then you have Jamaica, Kingston, Jamaica, Sabina Park. I'm sure everyone who knows cricket knows that. And then you have the British Virgin Islands, Antigua and Barbuda, St. Kitts and Nevis, Montserrat, Guadeloupe, Dominica, Martinique, St. Lucia, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Barbados, Bridgetown, Barbados. Here we have Bridgetown, Barbados. Then you have Grenada, you have Trinidad and Tobago over here, Port of Spain, very famous place if you know cricket. And then you have, so that's about it. That's the Caribbean region. I'm sure I've missed this Bermuda as well. There's the Turks and Caicos Islands. So this is the Caribbean region. Now, Indians know about the Caribbean because of cricket. India plays cricket versus the West Indies, which is a team that's composed of multiple Caribbean nations grouped together. And if you talk about the West Indies cricket team has always had multiple players of Indian origin, right? Rohan Kanhai, Alvin Kalicharan, Ramdeen, Shivnarayan Chandrapal, Mahendra Nagabuttu. I'm sure I'm missing a lot of names. Yeah. Some of the all-time greats from the West Indies have been of Indian origin. Ram Naresh Tarwan. So why do we have so many Indians in the West Indies? And what about the island of Mauritius, Île Maurice? So if you go to Mauritius, it's in the Indian Ocean. You go down south from India and go westwards. And east of Madagascar, you have Port Louis, this is Mauritius. And then you have Île Réunion, which is a French island, which also has a substantial population, but Mauritius is Indian majority. So it's technically part of Africa. The local language is French, or it is Mauritian Creole, and the majority population is Indian, of Indian origin. The majority religion is, if I'm not mistaken, Hinduism. Uh, yeah, so you have that. You also have lots of Indians in South Africa. Lots of Indians there. You go to Durban, for example. Significant Indian population in Durban. Durban over here, next to Pietermaritzburg. Cape Town also, you have Indians there, right? So Indian populations in various parts of the world, all colonial parts of the world. How did this happen? How did Indians end up over here? How did Indians migrate to the Caribbean, South Africa, Mauritius, and so on? So this was a system of what the British called indentured labor. Indentured labor under contract. It was created, the system was created to replace slave labor. Okay? So the British, the British Parliament, it passed the Slavery Abolition Act in 1833. The British, and by extension the white people, Europeans, they like to claim and proclaim on social media, we abolished slavery. We abolished this evil system. Right? Elon Musk says that all the time. We abolished slavery. But the slavery that they abolished, who started it? Who institutionalized slavery that the British ended? They themselves did that. The Americans had slavery. The British used slaves. And then in 1833, the British end slavery. And that's why they're the good guys, apparently. Right? So in 1833, the British Parliament passed this Slavery Abolition Act. And this created a severe labor shortage on various sugar plantations in various parts of the world. Okay? So to replace that, they created the system of indentured labor under contract. In practice, this indentured labor under contract, it functioned as a new system of slavery. It was highly coercive, but it was legally distinct from slavery, from chattel slavery. So indentured servitude is different legally from chattel slavery, because in indentured servitude, you have contracts, you have nominal wages, you have time limits, and so on. But in the real world, you had recruitment fraud, you had physical punishment, you had what they called plantation discipline, you had lethal working standards. Essentially, most workers had no real freedom. They were essentially the same as slaves. They were treated like slaves. When you were brought to a plantation, your life was at the mercy of the white overlord. Yeah, you had to do what you were told. Yeah, so there was a very little real freedom. So the British ended slavery, by passing this act, and then they launched what they called the Great Experiment in indentured migration. And they decided that we will go looking towards India for a large, cheap workforce. Indians are plentiful, right? So we'll get labor from India. So in the 1830s, so 1833, the act is passed. Next year, the British, started a movement of bringing Indian laborers, indentured laborers, to Mauritius, okay, to work on various plantations in Mauritius. Eventually, between 1834 and 1920, about 500,000 Indians were brought to Mauritius as indentured laborers. Okay, and most of them came from Bihar, Uttar Pradesh, and some of them came from southern parts of India. I've had friends from Mauritius personally. They are mostly from Bihar, Uttar Pradesh. Some are of Marathi origin, and some are of, at least one of my friends was of Tamil origin. Right? So that's what was done. And these laborers, they had to sign contracts, multi-year contracts. Okay, they would work on sugar plantations, sugar estates. Sometimes they would be redistributed like goods to some other places, maybe from one estate, one plantation to another one. Sometimes from one colony to another colony, maybe in the Indian Ocean, maybe to the Caribbean, etc. So initially, it starts with Mauritius. Okay, 1834, all the way to the 1920s. Okay, then they start sending Indians to the Caribbean also. Okay, they started shipping Indian workers to British Guyana sometime in the 1830s. Um, and the government of British India, which is the British occupation government of India, the British occupiers, they enacted some legislation in India which legalized the transportation of Indian laborers to places like Jamaica, like Trinidad, to places like Demerara. If you have heard of Demerara sugar, that's the place it came from. Then, in the second half of the 19th century, from 1850s all the way to the 1870s and almost 1900, this became a systematic practice. Take Indian laborers, make them sign contracts, ship them off to some part of the world. Okay, so about 2 million Indians in total, 20 lakh, were transported as de facto slaves to, I don't know, 10, 20 colonies: Mauritius, various islands in the Caribbean, Trinidad, British Guyana, Jamaica, Suriname, okay, also to Fiji, also to Natal province in South Africa, and also to places like Malaysia, Malaya, and East Africa, also to Sri Lanka. Um, Suriname was ruled by the Dutch. They began importing Indians from the in the second half of the 19th century uh, through an agreement with the British Empire. Okay, so the British owned the goods, and the Dutch agreed with the British that we will import your goods, which is Indian laborers. And then you had Indian laborers who started coming to Suriname and started working there. They had 5-year contracts. Okay, the promise was that after your contract is over, you will be sent back home, but that hardly ever happened. So eventually, this system of indentured slavery, indentured servitude, it was ended around the second decade of the 20th century, by roughly 1920 or something. But whichever contracts were signed, they ran into the 1920s. So what happened is that, in India there was this severe. See, India had been deindustrialized by the British. India had been devastated by the British. The British had engineered hundreds of artificial famines in India. Indians were starving. India's economy was being destroyed in real time. There was, because India was deindustrialized, all the jatis of the various people that we have in India, their traditional occupations had been destroyed. So there was no way to earn money and to sustain families, right? So people needed employment anyhow. So that's how they were able to, lure Indians into signing contracts. The promises were often that you'll get a high wage, etc. Maybe sometimes some people were even kidnapped into doing this. Yeah. The fact is that the wages were very low. The wages could be withheld based on any flimsy pretext. Okay. Um, Whatever men earned, women earned maybe two-thirds of that, maybe three-fourths of that. So women earned less than men. And if you deserted, if you did not work one day, or you tried to run away, you were treated as a criminal. Um, every day you were given tasks. If you could not finish your task, then you would be severely penalized. Maybe you will be flogged, beaten. Maybe your wages will be withheld. Maybe they will fine you 3 months' wages or whatever. Maybe you'll be imprisoned. Maybe you'll be killed. Killing was not that frequent, because the labor was, of course, valuable. That sort of thing. And once the contract of the indentured laborers was over, they were supposed to receive a free trip back to India, or a subsidized trip back to India. But typically, this never happened. Very, very few of them, these people, were able to return to India. So eventually, over time, these indentured laborers, who were essentially de facto slaves, they just settled down in the places where they had been transported, and they became essentially the foundations of the societies, Indian societies of Trinidad, of Guyana, of Suriname, of Mauritius, Fiji, and so many others. They were able to preserve their languages, whatever language they spoke. They were able to preserve their religion, Hinduism. They were able to preserve their cultural practices, and they also created new local communities, the Indian diaspora, right? Um, so that's the story of the indentured Indians who were shipped off to faraway parts of the world. Right? So it was essentially a new system of slavery. That's what it was. That's the story. Okay. Next question. Nirvana Shanks says, was the British Empire's real power its navy or its bureaucracy? The British Empire and its real power, navy, bureaucracy. Well, you see, it is naval power, sea power, that made the British Empire possible. Without sea power, the British Empire would never have existed. So it all started with piracy. Queen Elizabeth, she was the patron of pirates. She funded piracy in the Atlantic and beyond. At that time, the British Navy was not very capable. So they relied on guerrilla tactics. They had these privateers, pirates, who would engage in slave trade and whatnot, and theft and piracy. But eventually, the British Navy got better, and it is this naval power that made the British Empire possible. So without the naval power, there was no British Empire. So the naval power made the British Empire possible, but bureaucracy made it durable, long-lived, and governable. Right? So the British started acquiring territories slowly in various parts of the world. So the Navy was the foundation of this expansion of the British footprint and eventual global reach of Britain. And then they had to administer the territories that they had occupied. So the Portuguese were not good at this, but the British, they demonstrated they were really good at this. So they had to create an administrative machine, an imperial administrative machine that would turn the capture of a territory into long-lasting control and revenue through extraction by various means. Right? So the British Navy, its job was to secure the control of sea lanes and trade routes. Its job was to protect merchant shipping, the ships that would be transporting all the plundered resources from India, for example. Okay, so the British Royal Navy, it protected this merchant shipping. It secured the control of the sea lanes, and through this, it enabled Britain to project its power globally. So today you have the US that projects power globally through its network of extraterritorial bases and the US Navy. Well, the British did the exact same thing. The British Navy did the exact same thing during the British Empire. So that was the role of the British Navy, and the naval supremacy of the British. It allowed the British to blockade their enemies. It gave the British the power to prevent any invasion of the British islands. Without the home base, what do you do? And the Navy also supported campaigns that captured territories like Canada, like India. So the primary strategic asset of the rise of the British Empire was the British Navy. But once these territories were acquired, the British used imperial institutions, the civil services, the Indian Civil Service, for example. These institutions, they converted the territory and the raw power of the British into systems of authority, of governance, tax collection, law, etc. Right? And over time, the British developed elaborate techniques, administrative techniques, like writing the law, codifying the law for a colony, civil services that are based on merit, and so on. So by doing this allowed a small number of officials to manage huge populations and huge territories for long periods of time. So that's the situation. The bureaucracy was very important. It was very important for the British. The naval power always came first, but the bureaucracy became the main instrument of everyday domination. So when you have moments of military success, those moments of military success have to be converted into long-term rule over a territory. So the naval power did that. It had these moments of naval success, but then the bureaucracy, its job was to control and administer the territory which was captured. Its job was to extract the resources. It was to enforce the rule long after the battles were over. So the British Empire's real power, it was the interaction between naval power in the frontiers of the empire and the bureaucracy in the interior of the empire. Right. Krishna of the Surinamese Netherlands says, in the book Indica by Megasthenes, the Greek ambassador to Patliputra, to India. So in this book Indica, it's mentioned that there were 7 castes in Bharatvarsha, but it was better organized than now with 4 castes. Does that also correspond with our own indigenous sources? What's my view on this? So Megasthenes was the Greek ambassador to India. He was based in Patliputra, present day Patna. And he wrote this treatise, this book about India, about what he observed in India. What kind of society does India have? What kind of geography does India have? It was a very practical book, the kind of book that you will find in a military tactical manual or something. So one of the observations that Megasthenes made was that there were 7 classes of people in Indian society. Okay. What kind of people? What classes of people? 7 classes. First of all, you had philosophers or wise men, okay, which would include Brahmins and other religious specialists. Their job was to perform religious rituals and sometimes advise the king. Then you had farmers, cultivators. They would produce food, obviously, and they were not required to participate in any war effort. Their job was to only cultivate food, which would be something that serves the entire society. Then you had herdsmen and hunters, people uh, who did animal husbandry, who kept herds of cattle or animals, and also people who hunted. Then you had traders and artisan, craftsmen, merchants, people who were engaged in production of goods and the exchange of goods. Then you had the warriors, soldiers, fighting men. They were professional warriors. They were distinct from other classes, and their job was to only prepare for war at all times and be prepared. Then you had bureaucrats and overseers and magistrates, okay, officials, inspectors, sometimes spies. Their job was to supervise the administration of the society, of the government. Their job was to supervise markets. Their job was to maintain public orders. Police also would have been part of this. And then you had the king's counselors and high officers, the people who were involved in advising the king and running the government at the high levels, and judging various things. Okay, so that's the situation that you had in India. 7 classes of people, and Megasthenes reported that there were no slaves in India. There was no slavery in India. So Megasthenes classified Indian society into 7 classes based on the function that people served in society. Now, does this correspond with our Indian indigenous sources? So India's sources don't mention 7 classes of people in society. If you study various Sanskrit texts, ancient texts from that time period, other time periods, there's no mention of 7 classes of society. The Indian texts emphasize jatis, innumerable jatis in Indian society, classified essentially into 4 varnas, 4 major categories of occupations. But innumerable jatis. That's what our texts emphasize. The 7-fold division is something that Megasthenes came up with. He classified the occupations of people, classified the functions, and he came up with a 7-fold classification, 7-class scheme. So Indian texts don't speak about this. It's also possible that maybe Indian texts did encode this information, but those texts were all destroyed. Because 1,000 years ago, all of India's texts, the majority of India's texts, were destroyed in the destruction of India's libraries by the Turks and the destruction of the universities by the Turks and the burning of the libraries. So maybe that information was there, but it was destroyed. But whatever information we have today, based on the evidence and records that we have today, there is no mention in Indian texts of a 7-fold division of the society in India. Right. Okay. Sahaj Dang says, shouldn't Sri Lanka be a part of India instead of being a separate nation? So I don't think I have to open the map to show you where Sri Lanka is. I'm sure all Indians know where Sri Lanka is. You ought to know. Yeah. So the question is, shouldn't Sri Lanka be a part of India instead of being a separate nation? Well, let's go back to history, various historical periods in our history, and place Sri Lanka in the context. If we talk about the Mauryan period, that's about 2300 years ago, roughly. Chandragupta Maurya, Bindusar, Ashok, and so on. And the Mauryan Empire was at its greatest extent during Emperor Ashok's time. At that time, was Sri Lanka part of India? Was Sri Lanka administered from Patliputra? It wasn't. Was it a vassal? Possibly. But it wasn't part of the empire. If we talk about the subsequent great empire, the Kushan Empire, was Sri Lanka part of the Kushan Empire? It wasn't. Next, you have the Gupta Empire, huge, vast empire. Was Sri Lanka ever a part of the Gupta Empire? As far as I can remember, it wasn't, but let's fact check my memory. Let's find out. Okay. Was Sri Lanka part of the Gupta Empire's territory? Let's see. So Sri Lanka was not a formal territory of the Gupta Empire, but it was a vassal state of the Gupta Empire. There, Sri Lanka's ruler acknowledged the Gupta Emperor Samudragupta's suzerainty. So Sri Lanka was a vassal. It was not officially, formally part of India. It wasn't. Gupta Empire. Then the next great empire is the Chola Empire. Rajendra Chola, whether it is Rajaraj or Rajendra, one of those two conquered Sri Lanka, and Sri Lanka was part of the official territory. It was formally part of the Chola Empire. So yes, Chola Empire, Sri Lanka was part of India. Then what's next? Maratha Empire. Sri Lanka was not part of the Maratha Empire. British Raj, it was part of the British Raj, but that's not an Indian empire. It's a conquest empire, right? It's a foreign occupying force. So we don't discuss that. We're talking about our history, not the history that foreigners imposed upon us. So if we examine all these different empires that have ruled India, that have been part of our history, our government, our administration, apart from the Chola Empire, none of the other empires had incorporated Sri Lanka formally into its territory. So Sri Lanka is obviously part of the subcontinental region. The Sri Lankan people have the same genetics as us, the same religious and cultural and civilizational heritage as us. They're essentially the same people as us. The language they speak is an Aryan language, Indo-Aryan language. Of course, there is a sizable Tamil population in Sri Lanka who speak Tamil, but once again, same people, right? So Sri Lanka is a nation that's essentially Indian, but it's a separate nation state. So should Sri Lanka be a part of India? It depends on the context. When Joseph Stalin was shown a map of India, he pointed at Sri Lanka and said, "What is this island?" And he was told it's a separate country. He said, "Why is it a separate country? Are you people crazy?" So yeah, from that perspective, if you are a great power, you should incorporate all territories that you can. So the situation today is such that India isn't that powerful. Right now, the situation is such that the greatest, just like the most powerful nation in Western Europe isn't Germany or France or England, it's the United States. Even though the US is geographically not part of Europe, it is still the most powerful entity, the most powerful nation in Western Europe. Similarly, today we have a situation that the most powerful nation in the Indian subcontinent isn't India. It's the United States. And in that situation, there's no way India can make Sri Lanka part of the nation. Maybe in the future, if India becomes way more powerful, may happen. We'll see about that. So it's not about is it morally correct for Sri Lanka to be part of India. There's no morality in geopolitics. It's all about, can you do it? Are you powerful enough to make it happen? And India today is not powerful enough to make it happen. Okay. Nirvana Shanks says, what was the Wild West? How did expansion, frontier life, conflict with the Native Americans, lawlessness, and economic opportunities define this period in American history? Okay, Wild West. Let's go to the map. And I'm going to show you the river Mississippi because it's going to be, well, relevant to what we're going to discuss here. So once again, we go to North America. Okay, and let's search for the Mississippi River. Mississippi River, United States. It's giving me just 1 point. Okay, look, the Mississippi River, it drains out near Galveston. No, New Orleans, sorry. So somewhere here you have the drainage basin of the Mississippi River. Is it here? It's somewhere New Orleans, obviously. So is this the Mississippi? Yeah, this is the Mississippi. So the Mississippi River drains out into the Gulf of Mexico in the New Orleans region. Now, if you go north, if you go to, for example, Minneapolis, which is all the way north, Minneapolis, Minnesota. Well, if you zoom in, which river do we have here? It's the Mississippi. Would you believe it? And the Mississippi originates somewhere up here, up north. I'm not going to try and trace out the origins. I once did that. This is the Mississippi. It originates in a lake or something up north here, somewhere here. So it's a massive, gigantic river, the longest river system in the world. And it kind of divides the US into two halves. Not two halves, but an eastern part of the US and the western part of the US. And the Wild West was the region west of the Mississippi River. Okay, so that's the starting point of our discussion. The Wild West was the region of the US, present-day US, which was west of the Mississippi River. So that's the geographical context. But what about the temporal context? What time period are we talking about? Wild West. We're talking about the 19th century. So the American Civil War ended in 1865. So from the time of the end of the Civil War in the US, 1865, to about 1900, that's the time period we're talking about when we're talking about the Wild West. So it was this frontier region of the US west of the Mississippi, and the frontier was always pushing westwards. Okay, so this period between 1865 and 1900 is when most of the western territories in the US were settled forcibly by the European origin people. They were settled, the territories were grabbed, they were fenced up, and then they were linked by railroads and roads. And then states were created. For example, Delaware is in the east, but yeah, you get the point. These states were created. So this period, what did you have in this period? You had rapid westward expansion of European colonists, settlers. They had to face harsh living conditions because there was no settlement there, European settlement. And the Europeans, what they would do was that they had guns and superior technology, and they would violently displace the Native Americans from the Native American territories, which eventually became the US West. Okay, and when you have this going on, there is no law. There's no court of law. The territory is unknown. There's very few Europeans there. There's no one to give you law and justice and police and all that. So there was essentially no law, which is lawlessness. But there were tremendous economic opportunities because new land, inexhaustible quantities of new land. The land was rich in resources. You could do mining in the land. Much of the land was good for mining. You could do ranching, agriculture on the land. Cattle ranching. You could raise cattle on that land, and you would link everything through railroads. Okay, so in the U.S. government at the time, the government's policies supported a transcontinental railroad system, and this encouraged millions of European origin settlers to start moving and pushing westwards. and they were told whatever territories you grab, they're yours essentially, right? So huge, vast areas of grasslands, even deserts, were turned into farms and ranches and eventually towns, and people settled there. And the frontier line kept on inexorably moving westwards, pushing westwards. So new territories would be surveyed, they would be settled, the natives would be massacred or pushed out, right? And then these territories would eventually be turned into states. And eventually they pushed out all the way to the Pacific Ocean in the west. So life in the frontier for the Europeans was pretty demanding. It was very isolated, small settlements. Yeah, families would live in small cabins, small houses. They had to cope with very harsh weather, extreme weather. Yeah, they had to rely on farming, essentially subsistence farming. They had to rely on hunting, um, or they had to initially rely on small scale ranching. And then they eventually built up churches, and yeah, churches are very important for European life at the time. And then local committees and schools. Um, and At this time, you also had something that was a devastating event, man-made event that was happening in the Americas, North America. The the near destruction of the American bison. So the Native Americans, they depended, especially the so-called Plains Indians in the Great Plains regions, they depended on the on the American bison for everything. The bison were called buffalo. So their entire lifestyle, livelihood, everything depended on the bison. They depended on the bison for meat, for fur. They depended on the bones of the bison for various things. Everything revolved around the bison. So the Americans, the European occupiers decided, let's kill off every last bison. That way, the entire lifestyle and livelihood uh, of the natives will be wiped out, and they will become helpless. As long as the bison exist, these people have all the power in the world because they get all the food, everything from the bison. If the bison no longer exists, they will become completely helpless and dependent on us, and then we'll be able to make them do what we want. So the Americans went out with rifles and they just started randomly shooting bisons. They killed hundreds of millions of bisons. Then the North American bison was nearly made extinct. So this was going on at the time of the Wild West expansion. Yeah. So all these Native American population centers were devastated. The whites seized land for mining, for ranching, for settling. Whatever treaties they had made with the natives were broken. And then eventually they were able to subjugate all the tribes, massacre them, brutalize them, subjugate them, and push them onto reservations. Okay. And this process obviously involved multiple wars, which were called the Indian Wars. So you had wars with these native tribes. There were massacres all over the place. There were forcible removals of people from their territory and shoving them into territories hundreds of kilometers away. Yeah. There was resistance against the Europeans by groups like the Lakota, like the Cheyenne, and the Europeans retaliated with military campaigns and with policies whose objective was to end the indigenous control of the lands in North America. So you had all of this situation, and eventually they were able to start, settle down in towns, create towns, have law enforcement, um, and so on. But for a long time, you had a lawless state in the Wild West. You had theft, you had cattle theft, cattle rustling, they called. Sometimes you had big crimes and so on. You had vigilante justice. You had groups of people who would mete out justice. They were called posses. There are people who were hired as lawmen to fill the gap. They would have revolvers or guns or whatever. So everyday life for the white residents, white settlers, would be about routine disputes and so on, not the spectacular gunfights that you see in Hollywood movies. So that's how it was. And eventually, um, what you found is that the Europeans were able to push further westwards and settle, and this gave rise to tremendous economic opportunities for the Europeans. This attracted a huge population, very diverse population. You had all kinds of European immigrants, Germans, and Dutch people and all. You obviously had African Americans, slaves. You had Mexicans who would come and work. You had Chinese workers who had been imported, and so on. And all of this shaped the US economy, the US demography. And yeah, it was a time when you had essentially full freedom. So the Wild West was all about individual freedom and liberty and upward mobility. That was the Wild West in the US. Amisha says, why weren't Native Americans the primary slave population in America? Great question. The Native Americans were the indigenous people who lived in large numbers in the United States. Why weren't they made the slaves? Why did the Americans, the European colonizers, occupiers, why did they import African slaves? That's a great question. The reason is simple. The natives had large population groups. They could always escape and get refuge with one of these population groups. Even if you had different tribes, but they still all regarded the white man as the oppressor, as the occupier. And the Native Americans, they knew the geography of the region very well, of the entire continent essentially. They were very well adapted for thousands of years to the climate. So it was very hard to control them. And they were very good at escaping. And if they escaped, they would be fine. They would not die out. If an African origin slave escaped, he essentially faced almost certain death. The Africans were not adapted to the climate. They did not understand the geography of the region. They would be either recaptured or they would just die from exposure to the elements, the climate. It's not like Native Americans weren't enslaved. Native Americans were also enslaved. But eventually the Europeans decided that the African slaves were a better investment. Right? And eventually the natives were massacred and their populations declined drastically. So it made sense to have Africans come, and Africans were sturdier and maybe more reliable slaves. So a combination of these factors ensured that it was lucrative and seen as a good investment to have African slaves instead of enslaving large numbers of Native Americans. Natives were also enslaved in large numbers, but eventually Africans were preferred because of these reasons. Okay, let's take maybe a couple more questions. This is an interesting one. Really now says, why do you think the US had so many successful psycho serial killers between the 1970s and 1990s? So the so-called golden age of serial killers. 3,600 killers. I'm not sure about that number. Definitely around 1,000, maybe slightly less than 1,000. 36 seems a little inflated, but whatever. So you had the golden age of serial killers. Way more serial killers than any other country, even after considering per capita and high reporting numbers. Also, do US cops get away with almost anything? So the US is the nation that essentially invented serial killers, I think. I mean, nowhere else have you had so many serial killers like the US. I mean, the names are kind of legendary, in the nastiest of ways. John Wayne Gacy, Ted Bundy, and so many more. Okay, so these folks, I mean, these people were just inhuman monsters, and some of them had the number of people they killed went into the hundreds. Some of them. So why was this the case? There are reports of serial killers in other nations too. You had one very infamous serial killer in the USSR. I forget his name. Who was pretty monstrous, but it's the US that has given the world this entire thing, serial killer. So why did you have this situation? So many serial killers, all the way from the 1970s to the 1990s. So the US is an artificial nation. It's been settled by foreigners, right? By Europeans. And much of the US is just wide open, very low population density. So from the 1950s, so the Wild West era was from 1865 all the way to 1900. The Indians were properly subjugated. The Indians, as in the Native Americans were properly subjugated around 1900 or so. You still had a few more rebellions, but by the time the West was mainly conquered, but the West was still the west of the Mississippi was still, you know, it still had a very low population density. And then by the 1950s, you had the explosion of suburbia, which means suburban neighborhoods, wide, open neighborhoods with low population density, where you have all these houses. The baby boomers set up houses there. So you had low population density, you had the explosion of suburbs, you had high mobility, you had highways all across the country, so people traveling all the time. So it was not unusual for you to meet strangers. Most of the people very often you would meet would be strangers. That's one. Then you had, from the 1950s, 60s onwards, socializing became an outdoor kind of activity. People would spend time socializing in bars, in pubs or whatever. And over there, you would meet a lot of strangers. So it was not unusual at all to meet a person you've never seen before, and you would not feel uncomfortable. At the time, you also had rudimentary policing methods. You did not have databases of serial killers or criminals. You did not have fingerprint databases. You do not have DNA databases. The DNA fingerprinting technology did not even exist at the time. So, because of these factors, and you had mercury, you had lead in petrol, in gasoline. So there was a time when there used to be a lot of lead in the gasoline, petrol in the US, and that damages people's brains and causes criminal tendencies, apparently. So combination of these factors created high level of criminality in the United States, and the rise of serial killers. And then serial killers, this entire phenomenon of serial killer became a popular fiction, etc. kind of theme. And those stories that would come out in literature and popular fiction and TV series, they would then serve as templates for new serial killers for how to execute their whatever they were executing, their methodology. So because of this, from the 1960s, 70s onwards, all the way to the 1990s, you had this proliferation of these evil, psychotic monsters, serial killers all across the United States, some of whom are very famous or rather infamous. And from the 1990s onwards, the United States had constructed this database of criminals with their fingerprints, eventually DNA information data, all of that. And policing methods became more and more sophisticated. So from the 90s onwards, it became, and then you had the proliferation of CCTV cameras. And then with the advent of cell phones, it became easy to track anybody. Because of all these factors, eventually technology caught up. And then it became very hard for anyone to be a serial killer, which is why you have so few serial killers today. And even if you have serial killers, they don't have too many victims before they're caught. So that was the phase the US went through, and it essentially is the nation that invented serial killers, more or less. All right, let's take maybe one or two more questions. I still have so many questions to take, but we have gone way past 2 hours, so I'll take maybe one or two more. Real Vladimir Putin says lots of industrialists in India date back their family business all the way to British occupation of India. It is clear that these industrialists were on the British payroll. What's my opinion? How did they get all the wealth? Look, during the British occupation of India, if you were an industrialist, you had to cooperate with the British. In all ways, in every way. You could only become successful if you had the blessings of the British. Essentially, you could only be successful as an industrialist, as a business person, if you were a British collaborator, which means you acted or you colluded with the British against the interests of India. As simple as that. It may be hard to believe for some of you because of the indoctrination you've got through the education system. Imagine this different scenario. 1940s France, occupied by Nazi Germany. France in the 1940s was under Nazi Germany's occupation, fully controlled by the Nazi Germany, by Nazi Germany, Third Reich. The French government, the Vichy regime, was a puppet government It was entirely controlled by the Germans. During this time period, if a French business was successful, what would it mean? It means that they colluded with the German occupiers. Otherwise, the Germans would never allow any business to succeed in France unless it colluded and cooperated and collaborated with the Nazi occupiers. Makes sense, right? Now that I give this example, but when I give the example of India, you're like, no, 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 never happened. It cannot happen. Every single successful Indian business that operated during the British occupation of India was able to succeed by colluding and collaborating with the British against the interests of India. As simple as that. And many of these businesses still kind of are big businesses today. So anyone who was wealthy in 1947 was wealthy only because of collusion with the British. Because in 1857, the British destroyed India's authentic royal families and they plundered all the wealth from every single rich, wealthy person who had become wealthy legitimately without colluding with foreigners. After 1857, if you are wealthy, it means that you had colluded with the British. As simple as that. They did not allow a single wealthy person to remain wealthy unless they were colluding with them, unless they were of some value to the British. That is a very harsh truth that we have to understand. Everybody colluded with the British, all those who were wealthy. Anybody who was wealthy in 1947 was a collaborator. That's it. It's the truth. Okay, I'm gonna end this here. Maybe I can, let's see the live chat. What do we have? We have 21 super chats. We have 21 super chats. Well, okay, I shall take those. That's gonna take another 1 hour. Let's see. Okay, my request is please stop taking super chats so that I can end this live stream at a reasonable time. Okay, let's see this. Chirag Srinath says, how much did the Marshall Plan really drive Europe's reindustrialization? And how fair is the Belt and Road comparison about US companies benefiting completely? Marshall Plan, it's been a while since I've thought about the Marshall Plan. I'm a little fuzzy on that right now, sir. The Marshall Plan, obviously, it did drive Europe's reindustrialization, but it made Europe beholden to the US in a variety of ways. Now, how exactly did that happen? I'm going to have to do some refreshing of my memory before I can tell you about that. Right now, I don't have an answer on the spot. It's been a while since I've read about this. A long while. So yeah, I cannot answer this question as of now on the spot about the Marshall Plan, but maybe I will revisit it in the future. It's Anjay. Anjay says, if Mr. Trump can move on with an invasion via BS excuses, shouldn't Mr. Modi go for East Pakistan? Are we so weak that we can't even monkey big boss? See, my friends, let me show you a harsh truth about the world. It may upset many of you, but my job over here is to tell you the truth so that you understand the world better. So here's the map of the world. You see, first of all, let's see Western Europe. Which is the most powerful nation in Western Europe? It's the United States. Even though the US is all the way across the Atlantic. The US is the most powerful nation in Western Europe. None of these countries can do anything significant without taking permission from the United States. Similarly, in the Indian subcontinent, the most powerful nation isn't India. It is the United States. If Mr. Modi goes for East Pakistan, the US will cripple India's economy without firing a single bullet through economic sanctions. That is the harsh truth. Is it Mr. Modi's fault? It's not Mr. Modi's fault. Mr. Modi has been doing whatever he can since 2014, and we have come a long way. But if we had started in 1947 or even in 1990, today we would be able to make a move on East Pakistan. Right now, we can't. It is what it is. That's just the facts. ICMB says, can you speak a little about why Chinese civil wars feature a lot more in top 10 deadliest conflicts. Is there a philosophical reasoning behind it? No, there's no philosophical reasoning behind it. There's a part of China that is immensely populated. The population density is very high. It's called the Hai Taikong line. Let me show you that. Okay, see, here it is. Hai Tengchong line. See, check out this division. The yellow portion is about 5% of China's population, 6%. And the red portion is 94% of China's population, very high population density. Now, historically, even the northern part of the red zone wasn't China. It's only the southern half of the red zone, which was Han China. And most of your conflicts happened there. Okay? These conflicts were part of China's imperial cycles. In a Chinese imperial cycle, you have a dynasty that rises, it becomes powerful, it creates an empire, it has the mandate of heaven. Eventually, it loses the mandate of heaven, which means it loses control of the country, and then it collapses, and there's a period of 50 or 100 years, maybe 200 years of just chaos and civil war. And this civil war it happens in population centers and whatnot, which is why you have extremely high casualties, extremely high, 50 million dead, 20 million dead. That sort of numbers that boggle your imagination. So that's how it is in China. Chinese conflicts are typically just mind-boggling in scale, and it's also something to do with culture, right? In India, you've never had civil wars, and even when you had conflicts between kingdoms, the conflicts would never involve civilians, never, because of the way India's society is structured civilizationally. It's only warriors who fight, and you never touch civilians. In China, there was no such thing. So everybody got involved and dragged into the whole thing. And that's why you had massive casualties, siege warfare, starvation, poisoning of water, cannibalism, whatnot. Shivanshu Dadich says, where can I learn about Vedanta or Sankhya or Hindu philosophy? What are the authentic sources? I am not the right person to ask this. If you want a book reference, I can give you one. Indian philosophy. Who was Indian philosophy? An introduction to Indian philosophy. The book is by this one. This one. Book by Satish Chandra Chatterjee. An introduction to Indian philosophy. I would recommend this book. This is a good introduction to Indian philosophy. It's in English, obviously. This is what I can recommend. Beyond that, I don't know. I am not an expert in Vedanta or Sankhya or Hindu philosophy. But this book gives you a good, decent introduction, high-level, introduction into Hindu philosophy. We also have books by Max Zimmer. I'm sure I've referred to those books in the past on this channel. There's also the Principal Upanishads by Sarvapalli Radhakrishnan and so on. But I would say the book that I showed you, that's a good way to get introduced to Hindu philosophy. Deva Koshal says, why has India not considered a China-Pakistan economic corridor style trade corridor with China or Russian aircraft, instead of relying on Boeing and Airbus? What does CPEC have to do with Boeing and Airbus? Okay, it's two questions you're asking me. Separate questions. Why has India not considered a CPEC style trade corridor with China? China is an adversary nation. China seeks India's balkanization. China agrees with the US only on one thing: India must not rise. How can we have a China-Pakistan, that sort of corridor with China? Especially when we have $100 billion trade deficit with them. They will empty our treasury even more. Simply can't happen. Why isn't India buying Chinese weapons? Tell me. Because China is an adversary. China won't ever sell any weapons. Similarly, China will never agree to a trade corridor with India unless it is in their benefit. If it's in their benefit, it's going to hurt us. Makes no sense, sir. Makes no sense. Why hasn't India considered Russian aircraft instead of relying on Boeing and Airbus? Because Boeing and Airbus are Western and they are better and superior. Yeah. I mean, does Russia have an answer to Boeing or Airbus? Which aircraft does President Putin travel in? Which aircraft does Putin travel in? So it is an illusion. It's an illusion IL-96. What's it look like? Yeah, it's a good one, isn't it? But the issue is that they don't have the best engines. But if it is good enough for Vladimir Putin, I suppose it should be good enough for ordinary people. But overall, Boeing and Airbus have better aircraft overall. The Russians have kind of fallen slightly behind in these matters. The engines that they use, the Western aircraft like the Rolls-Royce engines, etc., those are high quality engines, extremely good fuel efficiency, and so on. The Russian aircraft have historically been known for being fuel guzzlers, and Russia had this great aircraft industry: Ilyushin, Tupolev, um, Beriev, so many different manufacturers. Sukhoi, obviously, Mikoyan, Gurevich. I'm not sure what the status is right now. We have signed a deal with Sukhoi, right? The Sukhoi Super 100 aircraft or something it's called, which is an aircraft which can carry about 100 passengers. We're gonna manufacture those in India. That's great. So if the Russians can make high quality aircraft, it will be great for India to co-manufacture those, or even have some kind of arrangement agreement through which you can buy those or manufacture those in India. But overall, right now, as of now, at least the Western aircraft are superior. And India loves Western stuff, right? So yeah, but it's a good suggestion. It's a great suggestion. We should explore Russian alternatives to Western offerings. Godliness says rule based order and UN resolutions are for weaklings, but the big eagle, dragon, and bear can do whatever they want. What about Taiwan now? That's a good question. What about Taiwan now? What happens now? So the Chinese had the past few days encircled Taiwan and done unprecedented live firing exercises and naval exercises, air force exercises around Taiwan, essentially encircling the island. And some people interpreted this as a warning to the US: if you take Venezuela, we'll take Taiwan. Well, Venezuela is done. What happened to Taiwan? I don't see any move by China on Taiwan because Taiwan is not that easy. Taiwan is in China's backyard, but China can't take it. I think they have a deadline, right? Xi Jinping has given a deadline. President Xi has given a deadline to his armed forces, PLA, that by 2027, Taiwan must be reintegrated. We'll see about that. Now, Venezuela is done. Regime change has been effected. Soon, you will have that Nobel Prize winning lady who will be sitting in the hot seat in Venezuela as a puppet, just like Mohammed Yunus sits in East Pakistan, that sort of thing. So Venezuela is done. Now, what about Iran? What if the US makes a move on Iran, similar to what they've done in Venezuela? Will China make a move on Taiwan then? Because the longer China waits and the more of these pieces fall into the US lap, the weaker China gets, and the fewer options it has. So yeah, I think the temperature is rising now. What about Taiwan now? Well, that depends on President Xi Jinping. Does he have the gumption to order the PLA to go ahead and make a move? We'll see about that. I think it's still that's a big call to make. That essentially plunges the world into war. It can be very damaging to China's economy. China can't afford that right now. That's where we are. I think Xi Jinping can't make a move on Taiwan right now. That's where we are. Birup Sarkar says, has the quality of US diplomacy declined? In the 80s, they coordinated with Saudi Arabia to drive down oil prices and strain the USSR's economy. They seem unable to replicate a similar strategy today. See, diplomacy is an extension of warfare, and warfare is an extension of diplomacy. Diplomacy sounds very nice and sophisticated and polite on camera. Behind closed doors, diplomacy is brutal. Diplomacy is outright threats, arm twisting of the worst kind, the worst kind of threats, and so on. Diplomacy is nasty, nasty stuff. So it's the same thing as war, but by different means. Has the quality of US diplomacy declined? Why? Diplomacy, if it goes hand in hand with military action, has been very successful. They've taken Venezuela now. In the 80s, they did this with Saudi Arabia to drive down oil prices to strain USSR's economy. Seem unable to replicate a similar strategy today. They don't seek to do such a thing today. If they drive oil prices down, it's going to hurt everybody. And oil prices are, they are, well, unless you do something artificial like what they did at the time, oil prices are market driven. And if you artificially mess around with the oil prices, it's going to mess up the entire global economy. It's going to have second order, third order effects that you don't want. It may end up hurting the US. The US dollar is still the petrodollar. Yeah, it depends on oil prices for its legitimacy. It depends on oil supply for its legitimacy. I don't think the US even seeks to drive oil prices down right now. If they want, they can, but they don't want to. So, okay. 2 kilowatts photography says, I dreamt that you met Modi ji in an exhibition. All right. Okay. Nice dream. I have come face to face with Mr. Modi on several occasions. The last time was during the G20 summit in 2023. But yeah, I haven't met him in person, like, one-to-one meeting. That doesn't happen. But nice dream you had. May it come true. Okay. Opinion channel says 18-year-old, 1381 ELO. Oh, chess. That's a good rating. Education feels like a suffocating factory. Father says it's too late for chess. Mastery or degree for survival? Please help, got passion. Well, that's a tough choice, right? Dad says it's too late for chess. You're 18 years old. Why is it too late for chess if you're 18? 1381 ELO rating is a good rating. Education, obviously, it's suffocating. We understand. I would say ideally do both. Get your degree so your dad doesn't nag you too much, and in your free time, keep doing chess. Don't let the flame of chess die away. Or if you think you're really good enough for chess, then, well, the option is to take a risk. But risks are risky, and I am not the right person who can suggest take a risk. I don't know how good you are at chess. I don't know what your potential is in chess. If you have, if I will see, if hypothetically I see that you have the potential to be a top 20 player globally in chess, I would say dump everything and go for it. But I don't know where you stand in chess. Let me see, what does 1381 ELO rating mean? 1381 ELO rating. How good is that? Intermediate to solid beginner intermediate level, placing you above average in many online chess platforms like chess.com, but below expert levels. Okay. So you fall into a game's gold or advanced tier systems. Okay, above average, you're past beginner, you're intermediate, you're consistently challenging players in that range. For official FIDE rankings, 1381 is a specific numerical value, but context matters, and so on. So it's a solid rating, but you're definitely not a beginner, you're intermediate. Solid rating, but I don't know you personally, so I don't know if you have the potential for being, at the top, in the top elite ranks in chess. If you have the potential to be an elite chess player, well, then your financial security essentially can be taken care of by that. So in case you are that good, maybe chess is the right move. Otherwise, get your degree and continue chess. That's what I'll say. All right, sir. I understand how you feel. I've been there. Anyway, all the best, sir. Do well, make the right choice. Godliness says a lot of Pakistani PTI leaders and many Indian columnists believe Operation Sindoor helped Asim Munir a lot. He is now more powerful and dangerous. Your view? It is the US that helped Asim Munir. It's the US. The US needs Pakistan as a counterbalance to India. And Operation Sindoor had to happen. Do you please understand? After they do a terror attack like the kind they did, we had to respond. Otherwise, we lose our credibility as a serious nation. Do you understand? If we don't respond, India looks like a loser, a punching bag all over again. We had no choice but to respond. And that gave the US the opportunity to elevate a similar status. So once this happened, once the terrorist attack happened, we had no choice. We had to do what we did. So you can't blame Modi for this, right? That's my view. Biju Saikia says, my hot take is that the 2030s is going to be China's best but last chance to beat the US in terms of GDP. After the 30s, the median age will be around 48 to 50 years. The population will also decline heavily. China is going to keep rising. See, my view, my hot take. China is going to keep rising economically and technologically until the late 2030s, mid 2040s. That's when the decline of China will begin. Because then the median age will be above 50. So it kind of aligns with your hot take. But will China be able to beat the US in terms of GDP? GDP is okay. What China needs to beat the US in is technology and predominance in East Asia. If China can dislodge the US from East Asia, if China can break out of the island chains, that's a gigantic victory for China. If China can break out into the Pacific, the Chinese Navy. So all of that, the best chance will be, well, this decade actually. This decade, and the longer China waits, the tougher it's going to get for China. GDP is okay. It is the geographical confinement of China that makes China weak through the three island chains, first, second, third island chain. The GDP is okay, man. Even with a lower GDP, if you have a powerful military, you can do wonders. So that's how I see it. Kiran More says, any updates on Nepal, Sri Lanka, and Bhutan? No. Right now, no updates on Nepal, Sri Lanka, Bhutan. Biju Saika says, why did Big Daddy US allow Brexit to happen? Because they wanted the UK out of the EU orbit, and they wanted the UK to be a special lapdog for themselves. That's why. Sid Barker says, US captured Maduro, a special military operation. Absolutely. It's a special military operation ordered by Shri Donald Trump. If the US does it, it's good. It's for human rights. It's for democracy. It's for the Nobel Peace Prize winner, for putting her in the seat of the leader of Venezuela. It's all good if the US does it. If Russia does it, very bad. Okay, Godliness says it is Iran next. Also, your view on how we should manage our relationship with this power-drunk US establishment. Both Trump, MAGA, and Democrats want Modi out. Who is getting Nobel in India? Is Iran next? Well, logically, Iran should be next. Logically, Iran should be next. The Western Hemisphere is settled now. Whichever nations are slightly, you could say, anti-US, they are insignificant. Venezuela was the big prize with 1/5 of the entire world's proven oil reserves. That's done. Next, logically, it's Iran. Ukraine can wait. Ukraine settlement can wait. Yeah. So the question is, what does Russia do about it? What does China do about it? Okay, how should we manage our relationship with the US? Manage it. The only solution India has, only option, only solution is to keep quiet, absorb all the pain, all the insults, and work on the economy. No masterstroke reactions, no hard, harsh words, nothing. Just shut up and do your job. That's it. That is the only solution India has. 20 years of pain and growth. Keep growing 6, 7, 8% per year, ideally 10% per year. That's all. That's the only thing India can do. There is no other option. We should have started this process 20 years before it started. Not in 2014, but in 1994. So this is where we are now. So we have no option. Yeah, everyone wants Modi out. We know that. Who's getting Nobel in India? I don't know. Uh, Ajay Aditya. Ajay Aditya. Thank you very much, sir. Ajay Aditya ji. Thank you very much. Biju Saikia says, it's just a fun fact that shocked me today. Zoroaster, Socrates, Buddha, Confucius were all alive at the same time. We're not quite sure of that. I'm not sure about the real date of the Buddha, Gautam Buddha. I think there's a very high chance that our ancient chronology is just completely wrong. Zoroaster, once again, we're not quite sure when he lived. We're not sure. Probably after the reign of Kurush, Cyrus the Great, because Cyrus was not Zoroastrian. His descendants were. But once again, is that the right time period? We're not 100% sure. And Buddha, about 2.5 millennia ago, but there's lots of question marks actually about the sheet anchors of India's history. So, Anirudh Kumar says, Venezuela is about to be made America's oil producing puppet or colony, like the US. Why doesn't India do the same with Saudi, Qatar, who have its own oil colony and have its own oil colony puppet? Well, we could do it if we had the power. We could do it if we had the power to do it. We don't. We aren't powerful enough to do this at this point in time. Why doesn't China take Taiwan? China is so powerful. Taiwan is right next door. Why doesn't China take Taiwan? Because the US is too powerful for it. Similarly, India, why doesn't India take Qatar or Saudi? Because the Americans are too powerful. They will not allow this to happen. We live in the real world, right? That's why. V for Valor says, Urox, sir, thank you very much, V for Valor. Thank you so much for your kind words and your encouragement. I shall rock more. Thank you. UMXG lol haha says, please summarize the situation in Venezuela. Why US bullied them? I gave a half an hour summary at the very beginning of this live stream. So when the live stream ends, please go ahead and watch it. I've summarized as best as I can and in as much detail as is possible at this early stage in the regime change operation. Okay. UMXG lol haha says, Chat GPT disagrees with this. Persia itself was part of an ancient Vedic culture, then separated out into Zoroastrian, etc. Their language roots to ancient Indian language. They will not agree with it. So Chat GPT is not evil. It's just a poor AI system that somebody controls. Whatever inputs they have given to it, it's going to respond to you based on those inputs. And there may be some subtle biases coded into it. So it's okay. It's okay. When India makes its own AI systems, they will agree with us. This is a foreign AI system. It's ChatGPT's masters are sitting in the US. So it's going to do what it's told. The day India makes an indigenous AI system, you will get better responses. Maybe, hopefully, someday it happens. UMXG lolha says, Trump says US will run Venezuela until proper puppet installation. Thoughts? When will the world finally get peace from this nasty country, the US? Look, the US could rule the world for another 200 years, possibly. It's possible. So I can't say. Trump says the US will rule Venezuela until proper puppet installation. Yeah, of course. What else do you expect? That's how a regime change operates. So the US has removed the president. They've abducted the president and his wife. They've taken them somewhere. They'll be put through a fair trial or whatever. And they'll spend years and years behind bars. So that is done. Now somebody has to rule Venezuela now, or run Venezuela. So the Americans will run Venezuela until that Nobel Prize winning lady is brought in as the puppet. Until that time, this is how the situation will proceed. No big surprise here. Pratap VGM says, how Russia and China even allowed it to happen? The US is more powerful than Russia plus China put together. The US effected a regime change in Bangladesh. How did India allow this to happen? Because the US is way more powerful than India. The US is sitting on Taiwan. China wants Taiwan back. Why can't China take it back? because the US is way more powerful than China. That's how. Okay. Okay. Brown Leprechaun says, joke. You've put so much oil in food that America wants to invade you. Be careful about the oil in food. Be careful. Yeah, indeed. Giora TV says, Trump says US will control Venezuela until a transition is done and will not allow anyone else to control it. Absolutely. Now this territory belongs to the US. So the US will control Venezuela until a transition is done to a US installed puppet who will control Venezuela. So whatever happens, the US controls Venezuela now. So the US controls 20% of the world's proven oil reserves, and nobody else will be allowed to control it. Done deal, outstanding. Giora TV says, in my opinion, actions in Venezuela may be a strategic move to choke China's energy. Could Iran be next? Is the US preparing for China-Taiwan crisis, increasing the risk of a major US-China clash by 2026? See, like I explained in great exhaustive detail, Venezuela is home to about 1/5 of the entire world's proven oil reserves. About between 65 to 80% of Venezuela's oil the past 5 years has gone to China. But that accounts for only roughly 3% of China's oil imports. So even if no more Venezuelan oil goes to China, it will only affect about 3% roughly of China's oil imports. The majority of China's oil imports come from Russia, which is 15 to 20% of China's imports, and Saudi Arabia, another 15 to 20% of China's imports. Then you have nations like Angola and Iraq and so on and so forth, who account for the rest of China's oil imports. So by cutting off Venezuela's supply to China, it hardly makes a dent in China's oil imports. But Iran, if that happens, well, that's going to be a problem for China. So yeah, it's possible that the US may go for Iran next. Now that Venezuela is done and dusted, makes sense to go for Iran next. And that is obviously linked to Taiwan. And if Iran is taken over and they are able to create Somaliland and South Sudan that chokes off Bab al-Mandeb, the Strait of Bab al-Mandeb in the Red Sea, Gulf of Aden, if they can take Iran and you can choke off Hormuz, well, then China can be starved of oil. So it looks like the temperature globally is rising geopolitically. And there could be a higher chance of a major China-US clash in 2026. Indeed. The Rational Reporter says, I believe while China is our primary adversary now, due to proximity, the US will be the real end game. The US is far more stable. What do I think? I completely don't disagree with you at all. All right, sir. And that brings me to the end of today's live stream. Nearly 3 hours. Very interesting. So thank you so much, everybody, for the questions. And this situation is evolving. So we're going to continue this discussion tomorrow in tomorrow's live stream. And I look forward to hearing from you and taking your questions tomorrow. Until then, take care. Keep asking questions. Keep raising your standards. And I'll see you in tomorrow's live stream. Take care.